At chapter 5, starting in key issue 1, we're looking at where are languages distributed. Language. This is a system of communication through speech, a collection of sounds that a group of people understand to have the same meaning. We go deeper with literary tradition. This is a system of written communications. And when we're talking about a group of people, their literary tradition is how they communicate consistently. As far as selecting an official language, this is what's used by the government for laws, reports, signs, public objects, money, or stamps. So we start to have a group of people that are consistently using the same communication system. When we look at our organization of world languages, we've got a language family, which is a collection of languages related through a common ancestry long before recorded history. So way back in the day, we had language families that started to develop. We move down from there. We've got, if you're thinking about a tree, you move down from the family or the trunk of the tree to the branch, which would be the language branch. This is a collection of languages within a family that existed several thousand years ago. So we're starting to progress through history and getting more specific with the language branch. And then finally, we move to a language group, which is very specific. It's a collection of languages within a branch that share a common origin in the relatively recent past. And you've got examples of languages here. Looking specifically at our tree, you can start to see the language families and branches broken down. For example, you can look at the language family, which would be this trunk here. And let's see what exactly we're looking at. Okay, so we've got the Sino-Tibetan language family here. And it breaks down into the branches. I'm going to leave this on. So it breaks down to the branch, which would be like the Tibeto-Burman branch and the Thai-Kadai branch. Those are the branches, obviously. And then the individual languages would be the leaves. So if we're looking at all these leaves here on the Sino-Tibetan family, our biggest leaf is Mandarin, because that's the largest language spoken from that language family. The thing is, the larger the trunks or leaves, the greater number of speakers. So because Mandarin is the largest, you're going to see this huge leaf right here. The cool thing is, you look down here at possible prehistoric families, like language families that might have existed before the more developed Sino-Tibetan. You've got the Sino-Caucasian, potentially, below ground here on the roots or the beginnings of the trunk. So 2/3 of the people in the world speak an Indo-European or Sino-Tibetan language. Look over here at our pie chart. We can see that Indo-European is by far the most spoken. Sino-Tibetan is second. So Indo-European is going to be our English language family. We look specifically at our branch, and we're going to look below ground, and we start to see, let's zoom in here even further so we get an idea what's going on. That doesn't really help very much there, does it? But I believe it's Nestralig. And so we are starting at the roots prehistorically here, but we get to the Indo-European family, this trunk here, and it branches down into areas that are specific for different languages like German, in English, and we start to see. I'll bring our friend back here because this is helpful. We start to see that does not help at all because it doesn't make it focused. But as far as us, we're looking at the Indo-European language family. We're going to look at the Germanic branch. We see it branching over here. West Germanic specifically is where we find English, and there we see the English leaf here, along with German being the second most spoken. Yeah. So our leaf is going to be the individual language. The group is going to be the group of leaves. That's the Indo-European family, and you can see how many branches go out there because it is, remember, the most widely spoken. Distribution of language families. Indo-European is the most widely spoken. We're seeing that predominantly in Europe, South Asia, and the Americas. The other one that's huge is the Sino-Tibetan, which is found in China and Southeast Asia. The most common one in the Sino-Tibetan is Mandarin. It is actually the most used language in the world. You think about the population of China, it's the hugest population. Everybody there speaking Mandarin. I mean, so many people there are speaking Mandarin. Sino-Tibetan, a lot of languages utilize ideograms or logograms. This is the old term that was used. Now they're using logograms, but you might keep this in mind, where you have symbols that are representing words. And if we look here, we're going to try our tool one more time, and then we're going to move on because people are probably already like, okay, geez, just move on. Okay, these are language families with at least 10 million native speakers. So when we look at Afro-Asiatic, you think about where might that be? Well, of course, that's going to be Afro in Africa, the continent. What else do we see? The green, we're going to look at, or the white is really what we need to look at, because on this one, okay, it's not really white. It's supposed to be like this pale color here. Indo-European, you can see where that's spoken. English, United States, North America. We've got branches or families of Indo-European all over the place here. What's this one that stands out here? Of course, it's going to be Sino-Tibetan. And the green is going to be other that's not specified. Niger-Congo. You think about Niger-Congo region. That's the Niger River, the Congo River, Sub-Saharan. Well, why are they all speaking the same language families? It's probably because they all developed that way in that area. Other Asian language families. Austronesian. This is spoken by 6% of the world's population, mostly in Indonesia. The most common language is Javanese, which is spoken on the island of Java. Austroasiatic. 2% of the world's population speaks this, and it's based in Southeast Asia. The most common language is Vietnamese. Thai-Kadai, mostly in Thailand and China. You think Thailand and China. Japanese, it's written partly with Chinese logograms and phonetic symbols, and you wonder why might that be? Well, Japan and China, they're pretty close. So is it diffused as speakers maybe went from China to the island of Japan? They took aspects of their language. Same thing with Korean. They don't use logograms, but they have a system called Hangul, where a letter represents a sound with half of the vocabulary from Chinese words. So Korea is right there. The Korean peninsula is right there by Japan and China. So you're going to find similarities between these languages. And here's a sample of the Japanese alphabet right here. Language families in Southwest Asia, Central Asia, and North Africa. We've got Afro-Asiatic. Arabic is the major language in Southwest Asia and North Africa. It includes the language of the Muslim Quran and the Hebrew Bible. Think about this area is in the cradle of civilization where we all developed from, so it's only natural that the ancient texts might come from a similar language family. Altaic. This originated in the Altai Mountains between Tibet and China. Turkish is spoken there the most. The Soviet Union attempted to suppress this when they brought in the communist regime. But now, with the collapse of Soviet Union, we've got it back to multiple languages in countries like Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. I said this wrong. This is Kazakhstan, sorry. Then you've got Uralic, which would be Estonia, Finland, and Hungary. This is up in Scandinavia, and these few countries here speak this individual language family there. What you got going on? This is a representation of Kemal Ataturk, who orders all of the Turkish people to write with Roman letters instead of Arabic to connect with the economy and culture of Europe. So this is one way that languages differ when you've got a specific situation where Ataturk here in 1928 orders the people of Turkey to write with letters that are familiar to people in Europe so they can do business with them. African language families. In Africa, there are over 1,000 distinct languages and several thousand dialects, which have been documented. Think about the whole continent of Africa, how many different languages and dialects you have going on there. There's a ton. Niger, Congo. More than 95% of the people in sub-Saharan Africa, remember when we say sub-Saharan, well, here's the Saharan Desert. So sub or below that is sub-Saharan Africa. 95% of the people in sub-Saharan Africa speak these languages of Niger, Congo. Swahili is the second language spoken by 30 million people in Africa, but it's the only official language of Tanzania. So it's only one country that's official, but so many people speak it. Swahili is used to communicate with outsiders, but individual languages are still spoken within the same village. That makes sense, right? So within your village, you're going to speak whatever language is native to you, but to communicate with all these other villages and languages, they're going to use Swahili because that's more common. Nilo-Saharan, you see this in small pockets in North and Central Africa with relatively few speakers compared to other families, and there's a Nilo-Saharan small pockets throughout. And cohesion. This is just a fun example where the people speak using the clicking sounds. When they're talking, they might be like, sounds very strange, but I'm sure it's very natural to them. Afro-Asiatic, again, it's up here, northern Sahara region, and everything else is below the Sahara Desert, so sub-Saharan. It's related to other languages. Well, to understand that, we're going to look first at the origin and diffusion of the Indo-European family. We've got these proto-Indo-European theories. Like, where did it come from in the very beginning? One theory is the nomadic warrior hypothesis, where you have these Kurgans from Russia around 4,300 years BC, and they migrated towards Europe, Siberia, Iran, and South Asia. And they spread this Indo-European language due to conquest by horseback. So you can see this Kurgan hypothesis here, where they're coming in from the region of the Caspian and Black Seas towards the Mediterranean, spreading from the Kurgan hearth. The second option is the sedentary farmer hypothesis, which is much older, thinking that perhaps people from Turkey about 6700 BC diffused from Greece towards Italy, France, Germany, Iran, and Asia. And they did this very slowly due to agricultural practices. So you see them here in the region of Turkey, and they kind of spread both ways due to their farming techniques. Which one was right? I mean, I don't know. We look specifically at branches of the Indo-European language family. This is where English comes from, but these are the branches. We see the Romance languages, Romance meaning from the Roman languages, get it? Right? Germanic based out of Germany as it spreads, the Balto-Slavic coming all the way here through Russia, Indo-Iranian, of course it comes through Iran, so that's where we're getting that, and Indo meaning India. That's just a quick look there. Distribution of the Indo-European branches, where did we spread? Well, the Germanic branch. This is important to us because we speak English. German is also structurally similar with many words in common. Both of these, English and German, belong to the West Germanic language group. It's broken down even further into the High Germanic for German spoken in the high mountains, and Low Germanic for English spoken in the lowlands. I mean, this is kind of like, I asked myself, okay, why are we learning about this? But it's kind of fun because when you know about languages of people, you start to know how people communicate, you start to know how they connect, how the ideas spread through languages, and why there's conflict between them. So it's actually kind of fun for me. Distribution of Indo-European branches. So now we're looking at, well, we looked at first the Germanic branch, and now we're looking at the Indo-Iranian branch. This is the branch with the most speakers, with over 100 individual languages. You think about India, how many languages are going on here? Within the Indo-Iranian branch, we've got the Indic or Eastern group, which includes India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and the main language here that is spoken is Hindi. But of course, we've got other languages such as Urdu, Bengali, and Nepali. Of course, where's Nepal? It's over here. That's where you see Nepali. Then we have the Iranian or the Western group over up here in Iran, and you're speaking things like Farsi, Pashto, Kurdish, and the Arabic alphabet. Balto-Slavic branch, another branch we're taking a look at within the Indo-European family, where you have the East Slavic and Baltic groups, which is the most widely used. This is the most widely used Slavic language. Primarily, you're looking at Russian. This is spoken by 80% of the Russians. It becomes more important with the rise of the Soviet Union after World War II in 1945, but then it does end up breaking down again after the Soviet Union breaks down. The other group we have in the Balto-Slavic branch is the West and South Slavic groups. Most used languages are Polish, Czech, and Slovak. During the communist era, former Czechoslovakia tried to balance the use of this language between the Czechs and the Slovaks, and it didn't really work. These countries split in 1993, which separated them, and they no longer want to get along because they're separate countries, so it separates the languages. Former Yugoslavia, this was a country of many ethnicities and many languages. Well, this, after the devolution of the Soviet Union, was broken up into individual countries and languages. So now they have Bosnian, Croatian, and Serbian. The languages are very similar to the people, and they can generally communicate between countries, but still, you have individual languages. Here's just a picture of this Russian guy here, and here's an example of his Cyrillic alphabet. The Romance branch. Now, we think Romance, meaning romantic. Okay, maybe, but really it's because it comes from the Roman language or the Roman Empire. This evolved from Latin. It was spoken by I don't think it was Russian. Sorry, it's supposed to be Romanian. The Romans. This is not Russian. Spoken by the Romans 2,000 years ago. I have failed you, and I apologize. But you have the inclusion of Spanish, Portuguese, French, Italian, and Romanian. These are the Romance languages. Again, this is from the Romans 2,000 years ago, not the Russians. And these languages developed separately because of the rugged mountains and intervening obstacles. So the Romans spread their Latin language all across these lands because they owned them. But when that Roman Empire fell apart, because of the rugged terrain and mountains here, these languages became individual. They separated and developed independently into Spanish, Portuguese, French, Italian, and Romanian. The origin and diffusion of language families. Let's look at English, specifically the origin and diffusion of English. Well, it started off as Celtic in the British Isles. So here we are in the British Isles, and we're speaking Celtic, all right? Because that's what the tribes that live there. But then you had the Germanic invasion. The Germans, people speaking Germanic languages, came in. Those people were the Angles, Jutes, and Saxons. And so if this became the Angles land, it slowly over time became Angles land, England, English, okay? English. After that, you have the influence of the Norman invasion, where the Normans from Normandy, France, down here, came into England and conquered in 1066. And they, of course, used the French language. Where we start to see the blend and use of different languages here. If you find simple words in there, straightforward words, that's going to be from the German influence, back from the German invasion. Simple words like sky, horse, man, woman. When you use fancy words in the English language, that's coming from the Normans or the French, where you have words like celestial, equestrian, masculine, and feminine. That's the influences that remain in English to this day. And then, of course, English begins to diffuse across the globe into North America during the colonial and imperial periods. Think about Great Britain as it went over to North America, Great Britain a little bit later when it went into countries like Africa, the continents like Africa, and countries like India, and all across the globe, they're spreading English. English continues to spread a lot through U.S. military influence across the globe, and global business is mainly done in English. Origin and diffusion of Romance languages. Of course, we've talked about this already, where you have Spanish, Portuguese, French, Italian, and Romanian. All of these developed from Latin, the language of the Romans, but you also start to see Vulgar Latin, which was the influence of other countries that interacted with this Latin or Romance language. Vulgar Latin meaning you kept it very simple because you couldn't maintain your language and all this specific intricacies of it because you were interacting with people who could barely speak it. So you broke it down into very simple words, Vulgar Latin, throughout the territories. Not necessarily in Rome, but definitely throughout the territories, spreading throughout the empire. Example of this would be the word horse. It was pronounced equus, but the vulgar way of pronouncing it became caballos, which combined the English words equine and Spanish words caballo. And this is where you get these words now. With the collapse of the Roman Empire, these languages began to develop independently because you no longer had one unifying empire or factor that kept the language the same. That vary. Well, languages, they have dialects. Everybody may be speaking English, but there's different dialects. Dialect is a regional variation of language distinguished by distinct vocabulary, spelling, and pronunciation. And isogloss is a word uses boundary. This is the separation line where you're going to find different dialects on either side. U.S. Eastern dialects. We're looking at the East Coast over here. So what are the dialects in this eastern portion of the United States? Well, we got these different dialects through settlement during the colonial period. As people move in, they're coming from different places. Therefore, they're speaking different versions of English. In the north, we've got the Puritans that move in. They have very simplified, straightforward language. In the middle regions here, we've got the Quakers, the Scots, Irish, and German. People of many different backgrounds. So you're going to have a lot more influences. It's going to be much more diverse. And in the south, we've got the prevalence of prisoners and servants. So you're going to have language that's more simplified, and it's going to be different than straight up Puritan English. Current U.S. dialects and pronunciation. I really love it when I screw up. I can't even speak. Why am I teaching about English and pronunciation and dialects? Because I mess up all the time. All right, but here I am. I'm doing it anyways. Okay, so currently in the United States, we have 4 major U.S. dialect regions. We've got the North, the South. And you think about what's the dialect in the South? I think it's when they start talking like this here. We're in the South. I'm from Texas. All right, that was an exaggeration, but in any case, we've got the 4 major dialects. In the Southeast, we're thinking about the way people speak, and they use things that might sound like 2 syllables. So instead of saying half, we might be saying hayaf. Or if we say mine, they might say mayan. So we're breaking it down into 2 syllables. In the Northeast, we're doing things like dropping our R, where we might say heart, they might say hot. Use your heart. Or if we've got lark, which is a bird, they might just say lock. Oh, it's a lock. I mean, we don't even say lark very often in any case these days, but whatever. Soft drinks. You think about how people pronounce what they are drinking as far as soft drinks. In the Northeast, we're saying soda. I actually used to live in the Northeast for a while, but I don't remember anybody saying soda. I remember people saying Coke. But this is what Rubenstein says, is what people say. In the Northeast and Southwest, people are saying soda. In the Midwest, in the Great Plains, in the Northwest, people are saying pop. Hey, give me my pop. You want to go after school with some pop? In the South, we say Coke. Just all of it falls into one category, Coke. Doesn't matter if it's 7-Up or Dr. Pepper, we just say, let's go get a Coke. Oh boy, okay. So this is a video that one of my students found. It's just amazing. We talk about regional dialects. One of the interesting things you can look at is how people call cows. There's many different ways. Some people, if you're standing in a pasture, you're going to call across for your cows to come home and feed them food. You might say things like, coo. You know, that's regional dialect. People say things for different ways. This one is just, you get the idea. And you're probably asking, why in the world is he showing me this? And I admit, you don't need to see that. You can just move on and get to the information. You don't need this to score high on an AP exam, but it's just, it brings it to life. These people are very passionate about their language, their dialect, how they call in the cows. I just think it's fun because these guys, they have a state championship at their fair about it. So it's just a really good illustration. And the guy who studied from New York City, he was the one that actually ends up winning. So let me make sure I finish. Okay, dialects in the United Kingdom. Standard language. This is a dialect that's well established and widely recognized as the most acceptable. In the United Kingdom, they have RP, or received pronunciation. This is the standard language of England, and it's used by the upper class, the residents of London. It diffused from Cambridge and Oxford universities, and it's diffused through grammar books and dictionaries. This was what they considered the proper language. So within the United Kingdom, Southerners pronounce grass like gross. Like, I've got to move with gross, right? Northerners presents things like butter with butter. I'm going to have some butter, which sounds weird to us in the United States, but in English, they're very peculiar. They're very specific about their language. And there's a really cool clip from the movie My Fair Lady, which goes specifically into dialect and how Eliza is not able to pronounce her words correctly because she's from a region of the area that is thought of as more low class. And this guy here, the professor, he's trying to see if he can teach her how to speak high class. It's just like a minute long, so let's just take a listen to it. It's pretty fun.
Okay, so yeah, this is an older movie, and you might even think of it as kind of sexist because here's this gentleman that's teaching this poor younger girl how to talk the right way. But this is an illustration of the traditional English language being very important to them in England, in London specifically. And moving forward, make sure we got that. Yeah, the British American dialects of English. Americans don't speak RP because of isolation. We're not the same specifically recognized English traditionally from London because of distance and isolation. We actually created our own new version of English because with the New World, we came in new words and new varying dialects. The vocabulary was different because we had new words that were created with new objects found in the New World here in North America. Spelling was different. And one specific reason is because Noah Webster created the American Dictionary because he had pride for the United States and he wanted us to stand separately from the English of England. He would spell things like honor instead of the English version of honor, the British English. He in the United States would spell color this way instead of color in England. And pronunciation is different. We say fast and path. In England, they say it more like fast and path because it's more proper that way. That's RP. Americans say secretary, but in British, they say secretary, right? You think of the James Bond movies. And here's more examples of that same setup. These are kind of interesting to look at. Whereas we say gas in the United States, they say petrol. We say truck, and they say lorry, and it goes on and on from there. Distinguishing between languages and dialects. Romance branch dialects. Specifically, we're looking at Spanish and Portuguese. Well, you used to have this language called Castilian. Castilian arose during the 9th century in Old Castile, Spain. It spread over the next 100 years and became the official language, but regional dialects such as Aragon, Navarre, Leon, and Asturias, and Santander survived in secluded rural areas. So you had Castilian that developed, but rural areas developed their own little language pockets. The official language, of course, in Spain is now called Spanish. Portuguese developed as a separate language due to the separation of the Pyrenees Mountains. So you've got France, which is more northern and eastern, and you've got Spain that's more southern and western, and because of the Pyrenees Mountains, it's separated them, you've got these individual languages. Due to the worldwide colonial activities, Spanish and Portuguese spread to the western hemispheres. Spanish is now spoken in 18 countries in Latin America, and Portuguese is prevalent in Brazil. Seems like it's so much more, but you think about Brazil is a huge landmass, so actually it incorporates a lot of people in that area as well. Differences still remain between these countries. Both Spanish and Portuguese speakers have operations to standardize the language. They've done things to make the languages lasting and regulate it to where it doesn't have all these variations between countries. The standardization of the language spreads culture between the countries through books, TV, and printed materials. So here's some examples of where we're trying to figure out if things are a dialect or a language. Is it all within the same language and just a different dialect, or is it different languages? It can be difficult to do that because they can be very similar. Examples, in Italy, you've got several languages that used to be dialects. Now they're considered independent. In Catalan, Valencian, Bailar, you used to have Catalan separate, but now it's got Valencian and Bailar that are still considered dialects. You can hear that screaming next door. There's another classroom that's just gone crazy. I think because they're hearing me explain languages to them and they're really excited. Galician, this is still debated as a possible dialect of Portuguese, but then again, maybe it's a distinct language. They're not able to really decide and keep that one way or the other. Moldovan, this is the official language of Moldova, but it's only a dialect of Romanian. But the thing is, Romanian uses Roman letters, while Moldovan uses the Cyrillic letters similar to Russian. So which way is it? Creole, French Creole in Haiti, and Portuguese Creole in Cape Verde Islands. Are these languages or are they dialects? Are they separate, or is it all part of one language? These are areas where that is in debate. Creole, or a creolized language, is a language that results from the mixing of the colonizer's language with the indigenous languages of people being dominated. So you think about a creolized language, thinking about the Haitians, where they're using French because France colonized Haiti. Same thing with Cape Verde Islands, where you got the Portuguese going in there. So they're speaking versions of Portuguese, but it's creolized. Okay, finishing up chapter 5, we're in key issue 4. Why do people preserve local languages? Language diversity. We're going to look at some examples through multilingual states. States with more than one language. One of the first ones we look at is Belgium, where you've got the Walloons that speak French, and they're in the south, and you've got the Flemings that speak Flemish in the north. The Walloons, they dominate the economy and politics because they use French, the official language, and it's kind of all-encompassing. And even though they're in the south here's Brussels, their main capital, and they speak French there. And so French is kind of the way through their language that they dominate everything. Because Brussels, it uses both languages, but it's still French, which is the main language. And actually in the capital, they have to use signs for both languages. But this is a state of controversy to some extent. It's a developed state, and you're not going to see like fighting or anything, but it's kind of an underlying tone of where people are against each other because they're vying for power through their language. So this is a state where it doesn't necessarily work out. As opposed to Switzerland, where they have lots of language diversity, but they peacefully exist with multiple languages because they utilize a decentralized government where local authorities have power. So there's not just one location where everybody is concerned about getting their language in and getting all the power. They decentralize it, meaning they send it out to different regions, different places where people can have control over their own affairs, and it's not all dependent on one language, one situation, one area. Their 4 official languages in Switzerland are German, French, Italian, and Romansh. Language diversity. We're looking at Nigeria, another example. The situation in Nigeria is different than Switzerland because we have 520 distinct languages. They've got Hausa, Yoruba, Igbo, and those are the 3 main ones. You have lots of issues and tension because people can't communicate. They're all vying for power, and language actually becomes a barrier instead of something that unifies. And it's not, again, a developed country. They're still having issues with infrastructure, and so language becomes one more reason that separates. Isolated languages. These are languages that are unrelated to any other, and they're not in a language family. Examples are Basque. This is currently spoken by 666,000 people in the Pyrenees Mountains between Spain and France in northern Spain. And it's isolated. So the people, they haven't had to interact with other languages over time. They just remain the same, so they're not related to any other language family. Of course, they're interacting with people nowadays, but as it developed, they were pretty isolated. Here's an example of them protesting with their signs there. Icelandic. You think about Iceland, way up there in the northern Atlantic Ocean. It's part of Europe, but it's really isolated. For over 1,000 years, it's not changed very much because they've been on their own, and they haven't had outside influences. And Koro-Aka. They discovered 1,000 speakers in northeastern India. It is not really related to any other language family, so this is an independent, isolated language. Extinct and revived languages. Extinct language is a language that was used, but it's no longer spoken. Examples of that. Native Americans. How many Native American languages have been extinct? Early explorers recorded over 500 languages, but now we only see about 92. Think about all the Western Hemisphere, all of those native languages. A lot of those are now extinct because those peoples have been wiped out. Only a few remain. Gothic. This was widely spoken in Eastern and Northern Europe during the 3rd century, but because you had outside influences come in and convert people to religions such as Christianity, and during that time they used mainly Latin, they wiped out the Gothic language. Hebrew. This was used all the way back as early as recorded history. It was used in the Jewish Bible, but it became extinct and it wasn't used. Lots of those tribes and recordings were wiped out. But it was revived again in 1948 after World War II when the United Nations created the current state of Israel. And you had the champion of the current Hebrew language. His name was Eliezer ben Yehuda, and he had to create 4,000 new Hebrew words and bring it up to speed for the modern dictionary. And now Hebrew is the main language, official language of Israel, and it's spoken by lots of people again. Preserving endangered languages. Welsh is an example of an endangered language that's dying out. Although it was conquered by England in 1283, 611,000 people still speak Welsh. And you know where Wales is in Great Britain area. Welsh is the official language of Wales. And the 1988 Education Act made it a must to be taught in schools. So Welsh, they continue to hang on to it. It's taught in schools, but it's a dying language. Or it's spoken by a smaller group of people than English, of course. Irish. In the Republic of Ireland, Irish Gaelic is spoken by 350,000 people on a daily basis, and 1.5 million people say they can speak it. They don't use it on a daily basis, but they say they can speak it. To continue this language, they began to broadcast on television stations in 1996, and it broadcast only in Irish. They even began to ban English signs to separate them from the English people because they're very proud of their heritage. They want to maintain Irish as a language. Breton, it's spoken by 250,000 people in Brittany, which is an isolated peninsula there, and they hang on to that language and it's dying out. Scottish, you think about Scottish, they speak English, but no, they have their own language too. Around 60,000 people speak it, including the famous Robert Burns poem, Auld Lang Syne. You know, it's the one that goes, should old acquaintance be forgot, da 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 da. That's the New Year's Eve song that we sing that nobody knows the words to. Well, part of that's because it was originally written in Scottish. Cornish is another example. It became extinct in 1777, but it was recorded by a historian by the last name of speaker. It was a lady. And one of the things that she said on one of the last recordings that the historian wrote down was, she said, "I will not speak English, you ugly black toad." And that became like a saying for the Cornish people, and they started to bring it back as a way of standing against things in pop culture in England who were trying to force everyone to be the same. It was revived in the 1920s and it's now taught in schools. The global dominance of English, let's think about it. Almost everybody we know speaks English. It's more and more, you can go anywhere and just speak English and get away with it and communicate with people. One of the most fundamental needs in a global society is a common language, because as we're teaching each other, as we're communicating, as we're doing trade and business and politics, we need a language that we can all speak. More commonly, it tends to be English. This is facilitated by pop culture, science, and international trade. Think about it. Our TV goes across the globe. It's in English. Our clothing, how we communicate, how we trade, the science that we're creating here, it's all English. And so as people across the globe get in with that, they learn English, and it's all communicated in English. English is the official language of 57 countries. That's more than any other. 1/3 of the world lives in a country where English is the official language. Even if people don't necessarily speak it in that country, the official language is English. Lingua franca. Lingua franca. This really coins the phrase of communication. A lingua franca is this is a language of international communication. This began back when the Arabs met up with people of Europe who they called the Franks, because their language was simplified into communication that could go between each other, and it was the language of the Franks, or lingua franca. English is a lingua franca. It's easy communication between societies and different languages and cultures that everybody can use, and it's their common communication. Pidgin language. This is a simplified form of a language used to communicate with speakers of another language. So a lot of what we hear when we're communicating between cultures is a pidgin language of English, because it's very simplified and it's just the easiest way for people to communicate across different languages. Here's a look at English-speaking countries, and you can see that there's a lot of them. Okay, it doesn't encompass all of them, but if you think about the developed countries, we're speaking English. And of course, more and more, we're going to see all these countries, their secondary language is going to be English. If you hear screaming again, it's the classroom next door. Again, I think they're very excited about language. They're very excited about how I'm presenting it. Expansion diffusion of English. English was spread through the British Empire through relocation diffusion. People were moving, they're spreading the English language. But recently through expansion diffusion. It's no longer necessarily relocation diffusion, now it's expansion diffusion, where it catches on exponentially. Through two means. Number one, the diffusion of new vocabulary, spelling, and pronunciation. And number two, the fusing of English words with other languages. Specifically, we look at African American English, where they use lots of words. The examples of two of those would be gumbo and jazz. Those are African American words. Now we use them in everyday American English. Specifically, Ebonics. This is a dialect of English termed after African American vernacular English, where you have the use of double negatives and other simplified forms of the English language that are very specific to African Americans in some parts of the country. You also have Appalachian English, which is different pronunciation. You think about the Appalachians here, let's be stereotypical, where you have people that are living in the woods and they're on their own. Well, some of the things that we might think of them saying would be, instead of saying hollow, they might say holler. Instead of saying creek, they might say crick. This is variations to the diffusion of English. English also diffuses to other languages. Well, we've got Franglais, which is the combination of French and English. Some French are kind of upset about this because they want to maintain their prestigious, unique form of language, the French. There is some concern about the diffusion of English into their language because words like cowboy, hamburger, jeans, t-shirt, weekend, parking, software, and spam, now this has become part of the everyday French language. Spanglish, the combination of Spanish and English, where you see Spanish people using English words. For example, the English word shorts becomes chores in Spanish, chores for shorts. Vacuum cleaner becomes vacuum cleaner in Spanish. Parking becomes parking. So it's a combination, it's the diffusion of English, it's going into their language, but also it comes into our language as well, where we're using Spanish words, tacos, burritos, tortas. These are now English words as well, used in everyday vernacular. Denglish, where you've got the fusing of German and English. German, Denglish, coming from the German word Deutsch, so that's the blend there. Where you see German people saying happy birthday, instead of their harsher sounding, Herzlichen Glückwünschen zum Geburtstag. Like, I didn't say that right at all, but you get the idea. It just sounds happier and more uplifting maybe if you say happy birthday, instead of these harsher German words, so you start to see that blend. And then Japanese. Japanese play baseball nowadays, so instead of saying baseball in English and Japanese, they call it baseball, and knife is now knifeu. These are some of the variations as English has diffused to other languages. Spanish and French in the United States and Canada. Spanish speaking has become much more prevalent in the United States as we have people immigrate to our country. Some states have made English the official language due to concern over the increasing use of Spanish, and some states have embraced it, where they have signs that are made in both English and Spanish. This is a look at the percent of population that speaks Spanish at home, and obviously you can see the highest percentages in the areas where Spanish, Latin American peoples are immigrating into the country. All right. Then we look at French speaking Canada. A fourth of the population in Canada speaks French, the other speaks English. Most of the French speakers are clustered in Quebec because traditionally this is the area that was colonized by the French. Obviously they're going to speak French. This has been an area of contention, but more and more these days they're learning to embrace it as a unique aspect of Canadian culture. English on the internet. English further strengthened the dominance of English. I have no idea what I just said. The internet further strengthened the dominance of English because so much of it is in English. You think about it. The majority of the material on the internet is in English. Early users, as it was developed, were mostly English. Search engines, for the most part, and web addresses use English. Your domain names, it's in English. You don't type in www. Spanish word or Japanese characters. You type in www, meaning World Wide Web. That's English. And then even what you're saying is written in English. If you're going to look up education.com, that's in English. Right? You're not going to see Japanese characters.com. So it's more English domination through the use of the internet. Mandarin, however, in China continues to be on the rise and may down the line surpass English because more people in the world than any other speak Mandarin. The problem is, English is the most prevalent right now, and you can see how the languages of speakers has risen on the internet, but mostly we're still looking at English. That's the biggest one by far. Chinese coming up quickly. Chapter 6, Key Issue 1, where we look at where are religions distributed as we dive into religions. The first example we look at is China versus Tibet. In Tibet, which is in western area of China, they claim to be an independent country. Tibetan Buddhists, their spiritual leader is the Dalai Lama. In 1937, priests recognized 2-year-old Tenzin Gyatso as the 14th Dalai Lama, and they believed he was reincarnated from the 13th Dalai Lama before him. They brought this child to Lhasa, which is their capital city here, in 1939 when he was 4 years old, and they enthroned him the next year when he was 5 years old. Priest trained him for leadership and sent him to college. Tibet is dominated by Buddhist rites and traditions. However, in the 1950s, China invaded Tibet and installed a communist government. They destroyed temples and monasteries and closed them down. They forced nomadic herders to farm the land and be in one area. The people of Tibet attempted to rebel, but it didn't work out because guess what? China was a lot stronger. And Tibet, basically, was a peaceful nation. So thousands of Tibetans were imprisoned or executed. Because of this, the leader, the Dalai Lama, and 1,000 others fled the country. Why did this situation occur? Well, because the Chinese communist government had a problem with strong Buddhist traditions. And this is just one example of the conflict we might see because of religions and conflicts with other peoples. The distribution of religions. You've got two forms. We've got universalizing religion and ethnic religions. These are just ways we try to classify and put religions into categories. Universalizing religions attempt to be global and appeal to all people wherever they live in the world. They try to accept everyone and grow their religions. 58% of the world's population, according to adherence.com, is in a universalizing religion. The biggest is Christianity with 2.1 billion followers, followed by Islam with 1.5 billion people, Buddhism with 376 million people, Sikhism with 23 million, Baha'i 7 million, and Zoroastrianism with 3 million. Opposite that, we have ethnic religions, which appeal primarily to one group living in a small, isolated area. 26% of the world's population are involved with ethnic religions. The largest is Hinduism with 900 million, followed by Chinese traditional religions, where 394 million people follow that. Asian primal indigenous religions, there's many of them, 300 million people. And African traditional religions, there's different forms, but about 100 million people follow those. As opposed to these two categories here, we've got 16% of the world claiming to not believe in any religion. Those could be atheists, where they believe God does not exist, or agnostics, where we can't really prove if God exists or not because we don't see him. And here is a graphic breakdown of religions where you can see that as far as Christianity, Roman Catholic Church really dominates a lot of the Western Hemisphere, specifically Latin America. You've got Islam here in the Middle East and North Africa. You've got, of course, Hinduism and a little bit of Judaism down here in Israel, of course. And Eastern Orthodox branch dominates Russia of Christianity. Branches of universalizing religions. A branch is a large and fundamental division within a religion. This is the top breakdown of a religion. A denomination is a division of a branch that unites a number of local congregations in a single legal and administrative body. And then separate from that is a sect, a relatively small group that is broken away from established denomination. The big three universalizing religions are Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism. We break that down in 2% of faiths in the United States, and we see that Christianity has got a big portion of this pie here. Islam has got a growing portion of the population. Buddhism and Hinduism, and then non-religious is still a large slice of the pie. Christianity, the first thing we're going to look at in universalizing religion. Our branches are Roman Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox. In Europe, when we look for Roman Catholicism, we're seeing them mainly in the southwest and east. In the northwest in Europe, we see primarily Protestantism. And Orthodoxy, we see in the east and southeast. Again, when we think about Orthodoxy, we think about it mainly in Russia, because it's just where it's diffused to. Now, this isn't a graphic breakdown of these denominations, or branches, it's just a breakdown of Christianity in general and where you find it. Percent Christian, the largest area we're seeing it is in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa. This is all primarily Roman Catholic. Specifically, when we look at the Western Hemisphere, most people claim to be Christian, nearly 90%. Latin America is going to be Roman Catholic. USA is going to be leaning more towards Protestant, with like Baptist, Lutheran, Presbyterian, Methodist. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, they regard their church as a branch of Christianity, but separate from other branches. Of course, we've got a large percentage clustered in Utah. And here's the breakdown of the United States, where we see Baptists more in the south and east. Latter-day Saints, of course, centered around Utah. The blue is Catholic, and our yellow is Lutheran. Where's my background here? Presbyterian? We don't even see that. Great, they don't care about us, apparently. Thanks, Rubenstein. Islam, our second universalizing religion we're going to look at. This is the predominant religion of the Middle East, speaking mainly of North Africa and Central Asia. Half the world's Muslims live in 4 countries outside this area. So if they're not in this area, they're going to live in Indonesia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India. Because the main place Muslims are living is right here in the Middle East. Our 2 branches of Islam are Sunni, which is the largest branch. This is from the Arabic phrase meaning people following the example of Muhammad, their leader. The other branch of Islam is Shiite. It's a smaller branch, and it means from the Arabic word sectarian. And these are clustered in Iran, Pakistan, and Iraq, which is right here. In recent years, Muslim population in Europe and North America has increased rapidly because people are migrating from North Africa. Helped by the Nation of Islam, which was founded in the 1930s in Detroit, over this area right here of the United States, by Elijah Muhammad. And this brought a lot of tension with Malcolm X during the 1960s because there was discussion about what's the best way to be a Muslim in the United States and how do you interact with people of other faiths and with people of the Muslim faith. So there was a lot of tension between these two branches of Islam. Buddhism. This is clustered primarily in East Asia and Southeast Asia. When you think about Buddhism, we're thinking mainly China and the surrounding countries. Our branches are Mahayana, which is 56% primarily in China, Japan, and Korea. There's Korea. Theravada, 38%, especially in Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and Thailand, which is down here. And Vajrayana, which is 6%, and is primarily in Tibet and Mongolia, which is over here. It's difficult to count adherents of Buddhism because few people actually participate in Buddhist institutions. The functions are performed primarily by a few monks. Followers can claim to be Buddhists, but also believe in other religions. This differs from Christianity and Islam. Christianity and Islam state that you can only follow those religions. Buddhists claim you can follow many religions, so it's difficult to count their numbers. Other universalizing religions. Sikhism. You find mostly clustered in the Punjab region of India. The first guru, Nanak, from Pakistan in the 14 and 1500s was when he lived. The 10th guru, Gobind Singh, in the 16 and 1700s, introduced baptism and wearing turbans. When you think of Sikhism, these are the people that wear the turbans. And then Baha'i. This is dispersed in many countries, but primarily found in Africa and Asia. It grew out of the Babi faith founded in Iran, but it had a goal of overcoming disunity of religions and wanted to unite everyone together through the abolition of racial class and religious prejudices. Ethnic religions. Universalizing tend to spread. Ethnic tend to be among one people and stay in one area. They tend to stay where they originated. And you'll find clustered distribution because it doesn't spread rapidly. Hinduism. 90% of Hinduism is clustered in India. In Hinduism, they have allegiance to a particular god. Vaishnavism is the largest group worshipping Vishnu, which is the incarnated Krishna, and this is a loving god. Sivaism is the second largest group dedicated to Siva, a protective and destructive god. We look at India. The percent of our population, this is where all of our Hindus pretty much are living. You also find small percentage of that population in Nepal and Bangladesh. Chinese traditional. You think of traditions like Confucianism. These are people who follow Confucius, who lived from 551 to 479 BC. He emphasized ethical principles and orderly conduct. And Taoism. This was organized by Lao Tzu from 604 to 531 BC, and he emphasized the mystical and magical aspects of life. Where are we going to find our Taoists? In China. Other ethnic religions. Primal indigenous. We find these in Southeast Asia or South Pacific Islands. Primal indigenous peoples believe that God dwells in all things. Shamanism. They believe in invisible forces or spirits that affect the lives of all the living. Paganism. You find roots in ancient Greek and Roman practices where they worship multiple gods in human forms. And then Jukte. This is the North Korean religion organized by Kim Il-sung in the 1940s, and he practiced it all the way up to 1994, and he taught that this is where people are self-reliant. African traditional religions. You might find various types of these religions, but it's all throughout Africa, where they believe in a supreme God with a hierarchy of divinities. In other words, your divinities are in a certain ranked order. Some are more important, some are less important than others. The main one you think of here is animism, where you have inanimate objects that have spirits and life. Spiritism, you find this mostly in Brazil. It's the belief that the human spirit continues to exist after death and can communicate with the living through a medium or psychic. So we look at the decline in animism from 1990 to 2010. This actually should say 2010. That's a mistake in the Rubenstein graphics that they gave us. But you can see that people in Africa really believed in animism here, with inanimate objects and spirits that have life. And then as the Western culture is diffused, specifically Christianity, and also Islam, people have stepped away from animism. And the final ethnic religion we look at is Judaism. You find 2/5 Jews living in the United States and 2/5 living in Israel, the other fifth living in other portions across the globe. Judaism was the first religion to espouse monotheism, meaning one God only. This is in direct contrast to polytheism, the belief in many gods. Judaism is the earliest religion that is the foundation of both Christianity and Islam. Islam and Christianity found their roots in Judaism. 4,000 years ago, Abraham was the father of Judaism. He migrated from Iraq, the region of Iraq, to Israel along the Fertile Crescent, where civilization developed. 2,000 years after Abraham, Jesus was born, and 500 years after Jesus, Muhammad was born. Both trace their roots back to Abraham. And you can look at here, where you've got the Dome of the Rock on this slab of stone here, where Jews believe Abraham, the father of the Jews, prepared to sacrifice his son Isaac as God commanded. Now, he didn't actually do it, because it was just a task that God had told him to do, but he prepared to sacrifice him in obedience to God.
Have different distributions. Origin of religions. We know that there are two types. There are geographic differences between universalizing and ethnic religions. Universalizing religions, they have a precise place of origin and they're based on the events of the life of a man. Ethnic religions have unknown or unclear origins and they're not tied to single historic events. Let's break it down and look at each of them. The origin of Buddhism. It was founded by Siddhartha Gautama, who was a lord living a privileged life, sheltered from hardships, with a palace and a beautiful wife. After going on 4 trips and seeing the suffering of others, he lived in a forest for 6 years, meditating, and then he emerged as the Buddha, or the Enlightened One. He spent 45 years preaching his views across India. Within Buddhism, there are 4 noble truths. Number 1, all living beings must endure suffering. Number 2, suffering caused by the desire to live leads to reincarnation. Reincarnation meaning you're coming back as a different life form after you die. Number 3, the goal of all life is to escape suffering and reincarnation by moving into nirvana, achieved by self-purification. Number 4, nirvana is achieved through the Eightfold Path. Those steps are belief, resolve, speech, action, livelihood, effort, thought, and meditation. There's 3 different forms. Theravada Buddhism is the oldest form, and you must become a monk. Mahayana Buddhism emphasizes teaching and helping others. Vajrayana practices ritual tantras. That's a look at Buddhism. Christianity, its origins. It was founded on Jesus, who was born in Bethlehem and died on a cross in Jerusalem in 33 AD, but he rose again. Jesus was referred to as Christ, which means Messiah or Savior. The 4 Gospels of the Christian Bible are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they document the life and the miracles of Jesus. Jesus, at the end of his life, was betrayed by Judas. He was arrested and put to death to atone for sins, but his tomb was found empty. He rose again to claim authority over death, providing hope for salvation. Christianity, we know, is broken into 3 branches. The Roman Catholic branch, where they recognize teachings of the Bible. The Pope is the head of that church, that branch, and they believe that God conveys his grace through 7 sacraments of baptism, the Eucharist, penance, confirmation, matrimony, holy orders, and anointing the sick. The Orthodox branch of Christianity, it's the eastern portion of the Roman Empire that's split between the Pope and the Patriarchy of Constantinople. They accept the 7 sacraments, but they reject the doctrines of the Roman Catholic Church, added since the 8th century. So they're a little bit different. They have some similar traditions, but they're a little bit different from the Roman Catholic Church. Then the Protestant branch. It originated during the Reformation with Martin Luther, and he posted 95 theses describing how individuals don't need sacraments of the church, but rather all they need is a personal relationship with God. We look at Islam and the origins. Islam has 5 pillars of faith. The Shahada, there is no God except one God, and Muhammad is the messenger. Number 2, Salat, where you're called to pray 5 times daily facing Mecca. Number 3, Zakat, where you give generously to charity. Number 4, Swam of Ramadan, where you fast during the month for purification. And Hajj, where you make a pilgrimage to the city of Mecca. Within Islam, it has the same origins as the Bible, from Adam to Abraham, but Abraham His wife Sarah gave birth to a son, Isaac, and that's where Jews and Christians come from. But Abraham also gave birth to Ishmael by his wife Hagar, and they became the branch of Muslims, the religion of Muslims, Islam. Centuries later, Ismail's descendants, one of them, Muhammad, became the prophet of Islam. So you can see that their origins are the same, but Islam branches away here with the birth of Ishmael from the traditions of the Jews and Christians. Muhammad was born about 570. When he was age 40, while he was meditating, he received a message from God in which became the Quran. Islam is broken down into two sections, the Shiites and the Sunnis. After the death of Muhammad, there was a disagreement in the lineup and succession of Islamic leadership, and this is where you start to see that breakdown. The origin of other universalizing religions. Sikhism and Baha'i were founded more recently than the other three universalizing religions. Sikhism, the founder was Guru Nanak, and he traveled to South Asia 500 years ago, creating disciples called Sikhs. Baha'i, established in Iran during about the 19th century. Hinduism, our last universalizing religion, has no known specific founder, and its earliest documents were written around 1500 BC. Where you find Hinduism? Mainly in India. And here you see the distribution of the three main universalizing religions. We've got Buddhism branching out from Tibet in area, northern India, western China, Christianity from the area of Israel, also the Jewish area here as well when we get to ethnic religions, and Islam branching out from southwestern Asia. Diffusion of Christianity. Where did it go? Well, it diffused through hierarchical diffusion. Emperor Constantine spread through the empire, and he made this the actual official religion. Emperor Theodosius in 380 made the official religion. Christianity diffused to Europe through the conversion of kings and elite figures who made it the religion of these kingdoms over here in Europe as well. And of course, it diffused to Latin America through the Roman Catholic Church. And you think about Latin America, and it's so Roman Catholic with Christianity. Christianity also spread through relocation diffusion. It was contagious diffusion by missionaries and settlers as it spread throughout the New World. And you can see the places where the Roman Empire were. This is where Christianity spread, especially after Constantine started to spread it, and Theodosius created it as the actual religion of the empire. The diffusion of Islam. The successors of Muhammad extended Islam throughout Africa, Asia, and into Europe. You can spreading it all around from its hearth here in the Middle East. The diffusion of Buddhism. It didn't spread rapidly, but from its point of origin, it spread mostly by Asoka, the emperor of Magahan, the empire from 273 to 232 BC, and he sent missionaries out. When we think of Buddhism, where we think about mainly China, and it's still primarily found there, diffused only to areas, for the most part, which are adjacent. Diffusion of other universalizing religions. Baha'i diffused in the 19th to 20th centuries when temples were constructed on every continent. Sikhism remained clustered in the Punjab region of India, but it moved inland to India after the split with Pakistan in 1947. And you see a lot of that movement and diffusion after the years of Mahatma Gandhi in India and all the influence he had there, and the split up after Pakistan and India broke into two. The lack of diffusion of ethnic religions. Why don't they spread? Well, what happens is you have mingling with ethnic and universalizing religions. Traditional African religious practices have merged into Christianity because Christian missionaries spread to Africa and they started to mingle with traditional African religions, and naturally you're going to find Christian practices intermingled with that. In East Asia, Shintoism adapted Buddhist deities into their religion. So it's hard for ethnic religions to stay pure because you have the influence of other religions, universalizing religions coming in, because universalizing religion's goal is to add more inherents and bring the religion to other people. Ethnic religions and migration. These can diffuse if inherents migrate and maintain their beliefs and practices, but for the main part, they just stay in one area. Here's examples of where ethnic religions did diffuse. In Mauritius, this is a small island with no indigenous population. What happened there, nobody lives there, but then you had Dutch sugarcane workers come in to work the sugarcane fields, and they brought in Christianity. French people brought in African slaves who practiced their Muslim faith, Islam, and then Indian immigrants brought in Hinduism. So there you're starting to see where universalizing religions really take over areas, and it's difficult for ethnic religions to maintain their pure faiths. The diffusion of Judaism. It's practiced in many countries. Well, you think of Israel and Judaism. Back in the day, historically, Romans forced the dispersion from Israel in about 70 after the death of Christ. And they wiped out what was officially Israel, and they spread that religion and the Jewish people across the Middle East and Europe. The Jews lived among other nationalities for 2,000 years. They were forced to live in European ghettos, sections of the city only for Jews, where they were rounded up not only by Hitler but by others, especially though in the 1930s. During World War II, as that was raging up, the Nazis rounded up all the Jews and exterminated them in the Holocaust, and we know all about that. Due to that fact, the United Nations and other countries created the nation of Israel after World War II in 1948 and officially gave the Jews and the religion of Judaism their own country once again. So you can see why ethnic religions don't necessarily diffuse and universalizing religions do.
We're looking at why do religions organize space in distinctive patterns. Sacred spaces of universalizing religions. Christian churches, they reflect the cultural value of denominations and the region's architectural heritages. You think about churches, you think about where they're located. It seems pretty straightforward. Muslim mosques, central or open-air courtyards with pulpit facing Mecca, the direction of prayer, typically met with minaret towers. And if you think of the minaret towers, there's not a picture of them here, but they're the tall towers that you think of when you think of a Muslim mosque. Buddhist pagodas, tall, many-sided towers arranged in tiers, balconies, and slanting roofs containing relics of Buddha's body or clothing. And here's an example of the Buddhist pagodas. These are all sacred spaces in our universalizing religions. Baha'i houses of worship. These are built all over the world and incorporate scriptures from all religions. Sikhism, Golden Temple of Amritsar, the most holy structure in Punjab that houses Guru Granth Sahib's The Most Holy Book. And here is that actually located here. So these are easy to identify religions by their sacred spaces. More sacred spaces of universalizing religions. Ethnic religions typically have less widespread distribution because holy places derive from the physical environment. Ethnic religions we think about small, isolated, they remain within their place of origin. Universalizing religions endow holy places associated with a founder's life. You think about Muhammad or Jesus. Buddhist shrines, there's 8 holy places in India and Nepal, and you can see some of those places scattered through India and Nepal here. Like, for example, this is where Buddha ascended to heaven and returned to earth. Buddha's sermon, when Buddha discovered nirvana, when Buddha became enlightened. So these are locations that are very important in Buddhism. Final one here we're looking at is Islam, and this is associated with the life of Muhammad. Mecca is the birthplace of Muhammad, but there you also have the Great Mosque, the Kaaba, and the place of pilgrimage. Medina, Muhammad's tomb, is where that's located, and each year many Muslims partake in the Hajj, or the pilgrimage that attracts millions of Muslims to Mecca. Ethnic religions in the landscape. The Hindu landscape is tied closely to natural features with shrines near riverbanks and coastlines. Holy places are organized by a hierarchy, or some more important than the others. One of the biggest is Mount Kaila, located in the Ganges River in the Himalayas, which is holy because Shiva lives there. This is one of their gods. Purification occurs by bathing in holy rivers, so the Ganges River is the most holiest. You can see why these locations are on rivers, because that's where you can be purified. And the remoteness of a location and the hardship to get there adds to the purification. But recent roads and transportation have significantly increased accessibility. So you can imagine, back in the day, if you wanted to purify yourself, you might have to travel hundreds of miles by walking in adverse conditions and physical landscape, and that could really enhance your purification. But nowadays, you're like, I took a plane and a taxi, and I got there, so am I purified? That's just interesting how that's changed over time. Hindu temples, they were built to house various gods, but they didn't need large spaces because individuals worship alone. It's not like a Christian church where you have everybody coming together and worship at the same time. Hindu temples, they are set up for a few people at a time. Cosmogony. This is the set of religious beliefs regarding the origin of the universe. Where did it all come from? Well, ethnic religions, such as Confucianism and Taoism, believe that the universe is made up of 2 forces, yin and yang. And an imbalance in these forces creates chaos. So yin, you think about that, they are believing this represents the female, earth, darkness, cold, depth, passivity, and depth. The other force, yang, represents male, heaven, light, heat, height, activity, and life. So these are opposites. The solstice in cosmogony is also very important. Summer and winter solstice have significance, and some ethnic religions erect monuments to the longest day or longest night of the year. Think about Stonehenge over here. Stonehenge was erected, we're thinking, with regard to the solstice, the longest days of the year, especially during the summer when the sun is shone through the object of Stonehenge there. Universalizing religions believe that God created the universe, the earth, and humans. So as far as cosmogony, universalizing believes it was created by a all-knowing creator. Ethnic religions believe a lot of the times more in a earth-like force. Disposing of the dead. We look at what's the difference between religions as far as when people die. Burial. Christians, Muslims, and Jews usually bury their dead in a cemetery. Christians used to bury their dead in catacombs when ceremony was illegal because it was illegal to be a Christian, so they would have to hide their dead bodies. After Christianity became legal, they buried their dead around the church. It seems only natural because that's the location where people want to worship. With population growth, they had to find other spaces because as the churchyard became full and the city grew in around the church, they'd have to find other areas, such as a gravesite outside the city limits. Public health and sanitation considerations led to public management, meaning when things started to happen because of the plague, they had to have public authorities take over disposing of the dead. They could no longer leave it up to the church members or just family members. Cemeteries in growing cities typically were the only green space because we had cities explode. If you had an area where people were buried, they didn't necessarily want to build on that, and that was the only green space left. Overpopulation is now leading people to think about being cremated, meaning their body burned up, because then they wouldn't have to bury it. Cremation, this typically happens with the Hindu faith, and they consider it an act of purification. Religious settlements and place names. Utopian settlement. This is the ideal community built around a religious way of life where buildings and layout of the city all serve a religious purpose. And the ones we think about, of course, the big one is Salt Lake City in Utah by the Mormons, where they created this entire city, this urban population that they wanted to be perfect, set up all around their religion. But other ones we think about are Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, Oneida, New York, Ephrata, Pennsylvania, and New Harmony, Indiana, all places where people wanted to create religious sameness in a perfect city. Religious place names. People also name their cities for religious reasons. Think about examples like Santa Fe in the United States, San Diego in California, and so many cities in Quebec such as St. Denis, St. Charles, and St. Augustine. Like, look at all of Quebec, it's all saint. Religion played a significant role in place names. The calendar of ethnic religions. Ethnic religious holidays are based on a distinctive physical geography and include celebration of the seasons as critical for agriculture, as opposed to universalizing holidays that relate to events in the life of the founder of a particular place. Specific example, Judaism. They celebrate agricultural holidays to commemorate events in the exodus of the Jews from Egypt. Like we had the Jews in their tradition, they were slaves in Egypt. When they left, this was the exodus, and that plays a significant role in their calendar. Some of those days that they celebrate are the Passover, when the Jews left Egypt, when they were freed. Sukkot, the final gathering of fruits. Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, when Moses received the Ten Commandments from God. Rosh Hashanah, which is their New Year. Yom Kippur is the Day of Atonement. And the North Americans use the solar calendar, but the Jews use a lunar calendar. So North Americans, even maybe if they're integrated Jews here, they're going to use calendar based off the sun. But Jews, for the most part, they use the lunar or the calendar based on the moon. Calendar and universalizing religions. Islam, the lunar calendar. This is what they use. So holidays arrive in different seasons from generation to generation. For example, fasting in Ramadan, the month of Ramadan, will fall in a different month as the years go by. Like sometimes it's in the fall, later on it arrives in the spring. Baha'i, the year begins on the first day of spring, March 21st, and this is their holy day. They're supposed to attend the 19-day feast at the beginning of each month to pray, read scriptures, and discuss community activities. These are part of their calendar. Christianity, we know that the first Sunday after the full moon, following the spring equinox in late March, is Easter. Christmas is another part of the calendar for Christians. This is the birth of Jesus, and we think of it as cold here in the northern hemisphere. But guess what? In the southern hemisphere, when that occurs in December, they think of it as warm. Christmas is warm. Buddhism, where they celebrate Buddha's birth, enlightenment, and death, but they observe them on different days. Sikhism, this is major holidays that are the birth and death of the 10 gurus, especially when Guru Granth Sahib was installed as the holy scripture guide. These are things that universalizing religions celebrate on their calendar. The administration of space. How are spaces set up and governed? Hierarchical religions have well-defined geographic structure and organized territory into local administrative units. What do we mean? It's all organized, it's all governed. Specifically, we look at the Roman Catholic Church, where you have the Pope who's in charge of it all at the very top, then down from there you have the bishops, and down in local parishes you have the priests. Individual parishes, individual churches, or regions, they work with the regionalized authorities, meaning if you're a priest in the Catholic Church, you are reporting to the local bishops. The bishops are reporting to the archbishops, and everyone reports to the Pope at the top. Latter-day Saints, the way they have their hierarchical structure, they have wards or areas, and these wards are aligned by the board and president of the entire organization of the Latter-day Saints. So there's definitely a hierarchy there. That's different from an autonomous religion. Autonomous meaning self-sufficient. Islam, they have no official hierarchy, but they remain maintained through communication and migration. So they don't have an official person who's in charge of all of it, or a hierarchy. They all just maintain their connection through communication and migration. Protestant denominations, some of them have a hierarchy, but like Episcopalian Church and Methodists and the Lutherans, they definitely have a hierarchy. Like people who are in a structure of people who are in charge. But others, like the Baptist Church, they have individual congregations who make their own decisions. They decide how they're going to worship and who's going to be their leaders. That's different from the Roman Catholic Church up here in hierarchical religion, because Roman Catholics don't decide who's going to be their priest. Their priest is assigned by people who are higher up in that hierarchy. Autonomous religion, Judaism and Hinduism also have no centralized structure. That's our look at check.
Religious groups. Why can't people just get along? Well, first thing we're looking at is religion versus social change. The concept is fundamentalism, a literal interpretation and a strict, intense adherence to basic principles of a religion. What happens is, as global culture grows and dominates, religious fundamentalism becomes one of the ways groups can maintain a distinct cultural identity. Meaning, you've got all of these global ideas like technology and capitalism and buying things and turning away from traditions and religion. One way to fight that is to be a fundamentalist, meaning we're going to strictly adhere to our religion, and we're not going to accept any globalism. So this religion versus social change, as the global economy and culture expands to developing countries, people are exposed to beliefs and values that are not their own. Think about it. If global economy is spinning things like Walmart and McDonald's and purchasing things as very important and to make yourself happy, your religion might be like, well, our religion is we're not going to possess anything. That makes us happy. Helping people makes us happy. And you can see how there is a conflict. One of the conflicts we see is the Taliban versus Western values. The Taliban gained power in Afghanistan in 1996 and imposed Islamic values in opposition to Western values. These non-Islamic activities, they banned non-Islamic activities such as music, TV, internet, and soccer. And you can see this conflict where if you've got MTV coming in and commercials wanting you to eat a bunch of food and buy things, and you're Islamic, I can see why they might want to ban TV because, look, our values are different than Western globalization. So there's a conflict there. Hinduism versus social equality. Well, in Hinduism, you've got a caste system that limits untouchables. People of different castes, especially at the low level, they cannot interact with people at higher levels. Well, social equality says everyone's equal. Hinduism is different than that. There's a conflict. Religion versus communism. Here's a specific example. Well, in the area of Russia, you have Christianity and Islam, but then came the Soviet Union. It started back in 1721 when Tsar Peter the Great made Russian Orthodox Church part of the government. This was Christianity. After the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, the communist government led by Lenin created this anti-religious program. This was inspired by Karl Marx. So they basically banned religion. They banned Christianity. So at the end of the communist rule in the 20th century, this brought a religious revival of Roman Catholicism in Eastern Europe and Islam in Central Asia. Soviet Union bans religion because religion becomes more important than the state or the government. After the demise of the Soviet Union, you see Christianity and Islam come back to life. Buddhism versus Southeastern Asian countries. Well, you had lots of conflict going on in Southeastern Asia. The Vietnam War, think about it. Physically, it destroyed shrines. Monks, this is not saying Mons, monks immolated themselves in protest of these wars, meaning they set themselves on fire as a protest. Current communist government, they discourage religion, just like it did back in the Soviet Union, so we've got conflict here. Religions versus each other. One of the big ones that we think about is in Ireland. The Republic of Ireland is 87% Roman Catholic, but the northern section is 40% Roman Catholic and 46% Protestant. You can see where we're going to have a conflict. If most of the island is Roman Catholic, but the top portion is half Protestant, people are going to end up in conflict. So Ireland back in the day, it was a British colony for centuries. But poor economic conditions in the 1840s produced mass migration. People started to leave. There were lots of bloody confrontations that led to independence of Ireland officially in 1937 because the economic conditions led on and on and on to confrontations that just made the people rise up and gain their own independence. However, northern Protestants wanted to remain with the United Kingdom. They didn't want to leave and become their own republic. So these northern Roman Catholics discriminated against and segregated northern Protestants. There's going to be a problem. If people want to have a republic within Ireland, but then there's a few people that want to remain with the United Kingdom, and their religions are different. That's big issues. Over 3,000 people have been killed on both sides. You have the Irish Republican Army, the IRA. These are the Roman Catholics in the north, and they fight for national unity of Ireland. And then you have the Ulster Defense Force, or the UDF. These are Protestants that fight against the IRA. This still goes on to this day. Religious wars in the Middle East. The Middle East. All three religions trace their origins to Abraham from the Hebrew Bible, but after him, they started to diverge or go separate ways. Judaism, they claim the promised land of Israel and Jerusalem. Well, that's a problem because Islam, they claim that Jerusalem is holy because Muhammad ascended to heaven there, and other reasons. Christianity also says that Jerusalem is holy because this is where Jesus lived during this time. So we've got all three of these major universalizing religions. Judaism is ethnic, but you've got all three of these major religions. They're in conflict in the Middle East. The Crusades, we all know about these. This is when we had Muslims. They've captured most of the Middle East, North Africa, and France. What Europeans do is they launch a series of campaigns to take back this land and take back Jerusalem from the Muslims. But they also did it to block the Muslims from coming into Europe. So there's lots of conflict over the course of history. Palestine. This was controlled by the Muslim Ottoman Empire until World War I. Continued to have that conflict. After World War II, in 1947, the United Nations partitioned these two states between the Jewish and the Arab traditions. Jerusalem was supposed to be an international city open to all, run by the United Nations. However, Israel claimed it for themselves in 1948 and maintained their own state and even created walls to block people off. So here's what the UN planned in 1947, where you've got the Jewish state throughout what we know as Israel now, but it's also got areas for the Arab Muslim state, where people are separated and everybody has their own sections. Except that the city of Jerusalem was supposed to be international, meaning it's run by the UN and anybody can go there. Well, Israel, the state of Israel, this area. The United Nations creates borders and partitions in 1947, and in 1948, Israel declared they are an independent nation. That becomes a problem for other people in this area, specifically the Palestinians, because they live in this area as well. So Jerusalem, they claim it for the Jews. Palestinians, they have issue with that because they're Muslim. In 1948, 1949, you have the Independence War. As soon as Israel declared they're independent, Arab nations attacked them and fought Israel. Israel ended up winning and gaining territory, and at the same time, Jordan and Egypt, the neighboring countries, they gained land as well. So Egypt moves into the Sinai Peninsula, Jordan moves into eastern Israel. In 1956, the Suez War, Egypt seizes the canal. That's the Suez Canal right here. But Israel, France, and the United Kingdom fight to get it reopened because guess what? All of these countries use the Suez Canal. So Egypt, they blocked it off. So Israel and the other countries up here in Europe, they're going to have a problem with that. The 1967 Six Days War, after being blockaded again at the Suez Canal, Israel launches a surprise attack, gaining more land. They gain back Old Jerusalem, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and the Golan Heights, which is all this area around here. 6 Days War, they reclaimed that. It was still under controversy until 1973. Israel was attacked by its neighbors, but it didn't end up losing ground. In 1979, they finally signed a peace treaty where Israel returned the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt, among other things, but there's still controversy to this very day. The problem is all of these religions and countries are very, very close. They all claim the Holy Land, and so there's continually going to be a problem. And you can see, we talked about the UN partition plan in 1947. After the 1948 war, just a year later, you've got Israel with all of this land, including the Gaza Strip. And then after the 1967 war, you can see Israel and the West Bank, we've got problems because some of it is under Palestinian control, some of it is under Israeli control, and this is the Sinai Peninsula that they returned to Egypt. Conflicting perspectives of the Holy Land. It just goes on. Like the Holy Land is holy to a number of religions. After the 1973 war, Egypt and Jordan renounced their claims. So Egypt and Jordan, they backed off and said, all right, we're gonna follow what the UN and Israel are claiming to be their area. But the Palestinians remained the opponent of Israel because Palestinian Muslims live all throughout this area and they don't want to give it up to the Jewish Israelis. From the Israeli perspective, Israel is a very small country with a Jewish majority surrounded by hostile Muslim Arabs, and they needed strategic pieces of land to block these attacks. So they needed more land, they needed security. So this is their perspective. The Palestinian perspective was that, okay, who are Palestinians? They're all over the place. Some of our people live in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. We're integrated everywhere. Some Palestinians are citizens of Israel who are Arabs. Palestinians claim to be people who fled Israel after the 1948-49 war. Palestinians claim to be people who fled from the West Bank or Gaza Strip during the 1967 war. And they're also citizens of neighboring countries. So there's a lot of Palestinian perspectives that claim they are part of this land. The fight from the Palestinian perspective is led by the Palestine Liberation Organization, or the PLO, and they hear about that a lot in the news. That the Palestinians themselves, the problem is, even though they're united as Palestinians, they are divided themselves, being the Fatah and the Hamas parties. So conflict even within their own party. The West Bank barrier. Is this security for the Israelis, or is it segregation to block the Palestinians? So Israel built this wall, and you can see where they built it along the West Bank here, just outside of Jerusalem. They built it to keep Palestinian suicide bombers out of the city. But critics say the barrier is illegal because it claims too much land for Israel, and it cuts off Palestinians from water, fields, and work. You can see how this would be a problem. On the one hand, sure, we want that border secure. We want security. We want our people safe. On the other hand, you've got people that are blocked off from what they claim to be their land as well. It continues to be an issue to this day. Jerusalem, specifically the city of Jerusalem. This is contested geography. Judaism's Jerusalem. This is important because of the temple built by King Solomon around 960 BC. The temple was destroyed, rebuilt, and destroyed again, and all that remains is the Western Wall. This is all that remains of the temple of Jerusalem. And this is where Jews go to pray. Islam's Jerusalem is important because of the Dome of the Rock built in 691, where Muhammad ascended to heaven, and where Abraham prepared to sacrifice his son. And this is right next to the Wailing Wall. It is, let's see, where is it? I think it's over, Wailing Wall, I think it's over here. It should be over here. Where is it? In any case, there's a picture of it in just a second. Dome of the Rock. Does anybody see Dome of the Rock? Oh, we can't talk to me because I'm recording this. Never mind, but it's like right, Western Wall. Okay, there's the Dome of the Rock. Sorry, here's the Western Wall, and there's the Dome of the Rock. Sorry, I was thinking about the picture on the next page. The thing is here, Christians say this area, the Dome of the Rock, is their area because this is where Abraham was going to sacrifice his son Isaac. Muslims say this is holy to them because Abraham was going to sacrifice his son, but it wasn't Isaac, it was Ishmael. So even that's contested. These structures sit very close to each other, and they're almost on top of each other. Israel will not give back the city to Palestinians, and Palestinians will not give up their claim. It continues to this day. And here's where you see the Wailing Wall here and all the Jews praying to it, and the Dome of the Rock here. Welcome to AP Human Geography. We're looking at Chapter 7, Key Issue 1. Where are the ethnicities distributed? We're basing this off of The Cultural Landscape by James Rubenstein. Ethnicity. Let's look at some definitions here. Ethnicity is people sharing the same cultural traditions of a hearth. Race, on the other hand, is different. This is people sharing the same biological ancestor. And when it boils down to everything, really we're looking at the color of skin. There's lots of parameters that people used to try to organize race by, but they decided that's not what they could do. So biologically, the only thing we can look at is the color of skin. Racism is a belief that race determines human traits and capabilities, which leads to a superiority of a particular race. So that's not a good thing, right? Because pretty much we're all equal here. So if you are a person that subscribes to racism, you are a racist. So we're taking a look at an example of ethnicity here, and these are pictures of young President Barack Obama, where we've got him with his father in Kenya, who belonged to the ethnic group Luo. Here he is with his mother, who was born in Kansas, right here in the good old USA, and she had English ancestors. And then with his family there, his stepfather, who was born in Indonesia, to the Javanese ethnic group. So on the census, officially, Barack Obama makes a check on the box that says Black, African American, or Negro. We look at ethnicities in the United States, and what the country tries to do is take a 10-year census to get an idea of what ethnicities and populations we have living here in our country. Interestingly, they have two questions, and you can see all the races here. The ethnicities. Actually, that's correct too. All the ethnicities and races here in question 1, and it becomes difficult to distinguish between ethnicity and race because people have so many different backgrounds. But some of the ones they're saying here on question 1, they try to define things by race, with black and white. But we get into gray areas where we're looking at, okay, well, is Hispanic ethnicity, or what's the race? And so it does become difficult to distinguish between the two. So the way our census does it here in the United States, they they gave you question 1 with all of these choices here. And then for question 2, we tried to discern if you're Hispanic or some kind of Latino or Spanish origin, what can we categorize you as? Are you Mexican, Mexican American, or Chicano? Are you Puerto Rican? Or are you Cuban? So I find it interesting. Like, why don't they just put Hispanic as a choice here in question 1? And there is great difficulty. So we look at Asian American. Well, this is an ethnicity. Asian would be our race. African American is our ethnicity. Black is our race. Hispanic is an ethnicity, not a race. So I guess officially, Hispanics can identify with any race that they wish, which again seems kind of strange to me. Ethnic clustering, we look at the state scale. So there's distinct grouping or clustering of ethnicities here in the United States. It's very noticeable on the state scale because we see ethnicities clustering in cities. Examples here, we're looking at Michigan. You can see the areas where you have ethnicities. The red is signifying that we're in the major cities. And of course, we're looking at Detroit here, very large grouping population of ethnicities. So Detroit, they're 85% African American. For the rest of Michigan, it's only 7% African American. So obviously, we're all in Detroit. In Chicago, that city is 1/3 African American. The 1/12 rest of Illinois, that's it. There's only 1/12 African American, the rest of Illinois. So they're in the cities. New York City is 1/4 Hispanic, whereas the rest of New York State is just 1/16 Hispanic. Los Angeles is half Hispanic, and San Antonio is half Hispanic. So minorities, ethnicities, we tend to go to the cities. Ethnic clustering at the regional scale. Overall, in general here, we're looking at Hispanics in the Southwest. We can see large populations here in Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and California. African Americans, we're looking at the Southeast in Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, some all the way up as far as Maryland and South Carolina. Asian Americans, we think about the reasons why they traditionally were brought here and proximity. We're looking at them being to the west, mostly Hawaii and California. At the urban scale, what's our clustering look like? Well, originally we had European ethnic groups, and you might think of downtown areas where you have Little Italy and Greek town. But now that's transitioned into Hispanic and African American areas who have moved into those traditionally European areas as the Europeans moved out into the suburbs. So Hispanics and African Americans, we've got 90% live in cities when we specify those demographics, as opposed to 70%, 75% of all Americans live in cities. We look specifically at the city of Chicago, which is over here in this graphic on the shores of Lake Michigan. And on the south side of Chicago, we've got a large population of African Americans, whereas we do see a mix of European, Latin American, and Asian groups on the northern sides, where you can see the large purple area of Hispanics mixed throughout with African Americans and other ethnicities. Los Angeles, here on the shores of the Pacific Ocean, you've got African Americans in South Central, you've got Hispanics in the east, and we've got Asian Americans in the south and the east. Here they are clustered over here and in the east. With any of these scales, at national, regional, or urban, we ask why are ethnicities clustered the way they are? And one of the main things we can claim is chain migration, of course, because when people move, they're going to want to be in an area where people are similar to them, whether that be within a city, in a region of the country, or nationally. So that's our international migration of ethnicities. This is when we start to see slaves that are forced to migrate from Africa over to the New World. The first Africans arrived at America in Jamestown, Virginia in 1619. So we're looking at the eastern seaboard of the United States, or then, which was just North America. 4,000 Africans are shipped during the 18th century to the United States. Nearly all slaves go to the United States, most of them to the Southwest. What are they doing down there? They're working the plantations, of course. 10 million Africans are forced to the Western hemispheres. That's a lot of people, ethnicities that are forced from Africa over to the entire Western hemispheres. So internationally, we're having a lot of travel. In 1808, the United States bans bringing slaves, but still we have over 250,000 people brought in illegally, forced to migrate. So we see the invention, the use of this slave trade here, this triangular. We have different European countries operating in various regions of Africa, and they send slaves to different places in the Americas. So we've got from Europe, we're traveling to Africa with goods. We're purchasing slaves, or we're taking slaves, and we're moving them over to the Caribbean or the Western Hemisphere. And then from the Caribbean, we're taking these slaves back, from the Caribbean, we're taking these spices and rum back to Europe. So this is the triangular slave trade in all these regions. Then we have voluntary migration from Latin America and Asia. So these people are not being forced, but they're still traveling internationally. The United States, initially, they had quota laws that limited immigrants from Latin America and Asia because the thought at the time was they wanted strictly people from the Western Europe region. They wanted white people. But then they decided that as far as a world or global outlook, these quota laws were quite racist and they needed more workers. So, they realized that they could get cheap labor from other areas of the globe. And so we started to remove those quota laws in the 1960s and 70s. So we saw that Hispanic and Asian population increase. Most of these people are low-wage workers coming in search of work. Now, we see that even more are children of immigrants. So we've got, traditionally, if you remember, the average immigrant used to be a male traveling internationally because they could come over to the United States, get money, and send it back home. But then it switched over to females coming over to work, and now we see even children of immigrants coming over to work because they're bringing their families over. Hispanic people we see mainly from Mexico and Puerto Rico because those are the closest regions. Mexico because we can walk right across the borders there. Puerto Rico because this is a U.S. territory and we can gain access. But we still also have Asians from China, India, the Philippines, Korea, and Vietnam. Internal migration of African Americans within the United States. So internally, within our country, we see migration of ethnicities. We speak about that first interregionally, moving from or between regions. After the Civil War, where we had turmoil in the South, we had discrimination in the South, we see ethnicities moving north to gain work on farms that they can work themselves as sharecroppers or to work in the businesses. During the early 20th century, they moved along by roads, car, and bus. And you start to see these patterns. How easy is it for ethnicities to travel on the highway systems that we built here in the United States? And so you see a pattern of internal migration based on these roads. For example, on the East Coast, we've got people moving from the Carolinas to the major cities of Philadelphia, New York, and Boston because they were using Route 1, which is now I-95. In East Central, you've got them moving from Alabama, Tennessee, all the way up to work in the factories of Detroit and Cleveland. Why? Well, because there's not necessarily work down here. Because back then there was a lot of work in Detroit and Cleveland. They were moving along routes 25 and 21, which is now I-77. And if you drive, or if your family's gone on road trips, you will recognize that these are interstate highway systems and make it very easy to travel quickly. In the West, you've got people moving from Mississippi up to Chicago and St. Louis, which are major centers of industry, which we discussed later on. These are going along what is now I-55. And then, of course, from the Southwest, we're going from Texas all the way along Interstate 10, Interstate 20 to Los Angeles and San Francisco, which are major cities of industry and work on the West Coast. We look at intra-regional migration within regions. Looking at Baltimore City, for example, migration within cities. You've got ethnicities that cluster all in one neighborhood, where we began to see the formation of places which were deemed ghettos, where you have a very dense population, sometimes in not very many kilometers here, that you have lots of population. They're crammed into a small area. So initially, you had ethnicities moving to the middle of these cities and staying with each other because of chain migration. People want to live with the same people of their own demographic because they know each other. They want to support each other. But because that's where the jobs were. So ethnicities are moving in because of jobs. During the 1950s and 60s, as populations increase, as jobs increase, you see the ghettos expand out. For example, here in Baltimore City, you've got more people coming in for jobs. It starts to be less affordable to move to the suburbs because housing just continues to inflate in price. So ethnicities still move into the cities because, again, that's where the jobs are. That's where they can afford to work. This is where you really start to see the issue of white flight. This is where white people would leave areas on the edge of the city, close to the suburbs or even in the suburbs, because the fear was built up of ethnicities moving to your neighborhood. And realtors would even take advantage of this fear. They would encourage blockbusting, where they would tell whites to sell their homes for cheap because they didn't want ethnicities moving into their neighborhood. Because as everybody knows, ethnicities could be scary. At least that's how they would push the price increase. So they would convince white people to sell cheaply, and then they would raise the prices on the houses, getting major profits for the ethnicities moving in, thus creating white flight, where more and more white people would move out of the city centers to the suburbs where they could feel more safe, in quotes, theoretically, and ethnicities would move into the cities, building up more and more of this segregation. And this is really important because when we talk about segregation through the study of demographics and human geography, this is one of the major places where it starts to occur, where we have the separation clearly of ethnicities. Specifically in Detroit, in the early 20th century, we have African Americans moving in for auto industry jobs. Of course, this is Detroit. Whites move out. We see the white population drop from, it drops by 1.5 million in 1950, between 1950 and 2000. The overall population dropped from 2 million to 700,000 because honestly, we used to have the auto unions and they were losing the ability to pay workers their union rate. So whites were losing their jobs. They were moving out of the central city districts, and we would have some ethnicities coming in to take their place. But at the same time, overall, we're losing jobs. So we see that in Detroit, we're getting that population drop. We look at the segregation by ethnicity and race. Of course, in the United States, we've got that separate but equal law, which the Supreme Court upholds in Plessy versus Ferguson back in 1896. This is where we started to see the legal separation of ethnicity. Specifically, it was black and white in the United States. And after the Civil War, although we ended slavery, we still saw segregation in the South through the creation of unofficial Jim Crow laws that were not necessarily backed by the Supreme Court, where you had blacks, they were forced to sit in the back of buses, in shops, restaurants, and hotels. They could say, you know what, we're only serving white people. And legally, you had the separation of schools where you would have whites went to one school, and usually it was backed well financially, and blacks or ethnicities going to another school that really wasn't backed very well at all financially. So there was a huge problem with segregation, according to ethnicity and race. So in 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education officially eliminated segregation, such as these that we've discussed, in Topeka, Kansas, because they said that racial separation led to inferior education. Like, okay, maybe there was separate but equal according to the law, but when you look at it, the schools that ethnicities had were not up to the same standard as white people. So they eliminated that. They said that is not legal. But even today, you still see cultural segregation of ethnicities. For example, in Detroit, you've got the Detroit Institute of the Arts, where really it's just white European art. And then you have the Museum of African American History, which is this huge, beautiful exhibit, but it's all about Africans. It's all about the exhibit of people from that continent. So you still have this segregation going on in the country of ethnicities and races. We look specifically at the country of South Africa and how they went through the enormous issue of apartheid. This is where you had the physical separation of races into different geographical areas during the late 20th century. What they did is they classified babies from black, white, mixed, and Asian. And they said that each race had a different legal status and job. Pretty much they eliminated black jobs completely. They paid them way less. They limited their jobs, and they could not vote. So they really took a lot of the power completely away from the black population. They moved blacks to homelands where they segregated them. They put them in one area, which, to be honest, although it wasn't a governmental policy, you think about it in the United States, where you had ethnicities moving to the city center and you had whites moving out to the suburbs. It wasn't like a governmental policy in the United States, but it's kind of a similar thing that happened in South Africa. We have the separation by area. In 1991, South Africa decided to repeal this apartheid policy. And in fact, you saw Nelson Mandela released from prison after being in there for 27 years. Nelson Mandela was a proponent of ending apartheid, and they kept him in prison for all this time. And in 1994, they elected Mandela as the first black president. So you definitely saw the end of apartheid and separation there. And welcome to AP Human Geography. We're taking a look at Chapter 7, Key Issue 3, based off of the Cultural Landscape textbook, 11th edition by James Rubenstein. I'm your host, Andrew Patterson, and we're taking a look at why do conflicts arise among ethnicities. So we need to make sure we define things correctly here because these can get confusing. When we're talking about nationality, we're thinking of United States, China, Russia, England, Mexico. The nationality is people sharing legal attachment and personal allegiance to a country, right? Whereas ethnicity would be people sharing the same cultural traditions from a particular hearth or location. So when we're thinking about ethnicity, when we think about things in this country, we might think of Hispanic or Chinese or Asian American or African American. These are cultural traditions that hold people together. Race would be different, where we're looking at people sharing the same biological ancestor. So we might say someone who is black or white. Now, nationality can be similar to ethnicity as far as how we might identify or define these demographics. But nationality, you're going to have same shared cultural values a lot of the times. And ethnicity, that's one of the main things that helps define it. So these two things can be a little blurred. But let's see if we can clear some of that up. Ethnicity, we are looking at your background of religion, language, material culture. Whereas nationality, there's some things that can help define you, such as voting, your passport, and civic duties. Like in the United States, we identify as being from the United States because we're able to vote in this country. We carry a U.S. passport, and there's certain civic duties that we might have to do, such as going through the educational system. So we look at this picture over here, and we see that perhaps there might be some people of Hispanic ethnicity, but their nationality is going to be from the United States. All right, so let's look at some examples here. When we examine the United States, we know that our nationality is that we are U.S. citizens. We're citizens of the United States of America. But we might have lots of different ethnicities. We might be African American, Hispanic American, Chinese, or Polish, right? As far as race, we've already talked about this. It could be black, white, or many other colors. And when we look at the United Kingdom, it gets a little bit more complicated, especially when we're examining this graphic over here. And we look at the United Kingdom, we're like, is that one country? Is it multiple countries? What's going on there? Well, let's dig in. So within the United Kingdom, we've got these four colored countries. We've got these four colored areas here, which are all part of one country, which is called the United Kingdom. Okay, so we've got the English ethnicities, which is here in England, and our capital city is London, who are descendants of the Germanic tribes. We've got the Welsh in this red area here, which is in Wales, which were Celts. They were conquered by England in 1282. Up north here, we've got Scotland, where you have the ethnicity of the Scots, where they were Celts. They merged with England in 1603 when King James VI took over both countries. When he became king, he claimed both countries. And then in Northern Ireland, our ethnicity is the Irish, who were Celts that became independent in the 20th century because we had a lot of turmoil going on between the country of the Republic of Ireland and England. Okay, so within the United Kingdom, you have these four different ethnicities. When we're talking about this entire area in general, we've got two countries. We have the United Kingdom, which is the four areas we already talked about. And then we've got the Republic of Ireland, which is down here. So we've got ethnicities and we've got nationalities. Could be a bit confusing there, so let's try to keep that straight. Oh, one more thing there. So let's take a look at some examples here. When we think about golf, we might be thinking of Rory McIlroy, who is Irish Catholic in ethnicity, but he's from the United Kingdom. So we try to define people based on their nationalities. We try to base them off their ethnicities. Well, Irish Catholic, where would you fit that in? Would that be Northern or Southern Ireland? And, well, actually, that's where you might think it's from, but no, he's from more of the United Kingdom. Whereas Tiger Woods, it's clear he's from the United States, but what is his ethnicity? Is he African, Native American, Chinese, Thai, or Dutch? Because he's got all of that background. So it becomes difficult to clarify that. Nationalism. This is our spirit of pride. It's what makes us devoted to a certain country above all others. And certain countries create, all countries create this feeling of nationalism through different things like flags, standing to say the pledge, patriotic songs. This is what we're calling a centripetal force, where it's an attitude that unifies a people. Centripetal meaning something that centers you around a core in the middle. Centripetal. Centrifugal would be the opposite, where it's pushing people or forces away. But if you look here, of course, we feel very patriotic with the United States flag. And I want to be honest with you, I did not even know that the flag of Russia looked like this currently. Because I grew up through the 80s and the years of the communist Red Scare in the United States, I was taught to fear this flag right here with the hammer and sickle of the Soviet Union, the former communist states there. So this is the current Russian flag. Let's look at some specific examples where we're getting some conflict between ethnicities. So we're here in the continent of Asia, and we're zooming into Lebanon. In 1943, Lebanon gains independence. We've got the idea that the religious factions are supposed to be represented equally within the government, but that doesn't turn out to be quite true, because historically you had Christians who had the majority, but they lost their power over time, and Muslims gained strength. So you have this vying for power between groups, and in 1975, a civil war erupts, and it brings big changes to social and economic conditions. Because each group formed its own army and they fought and they vied for territory, and it was a huge conflict. So eventually you had the United States and Syria over here that's adjacent to Lebanon. They come in and they try to send in troops to restore the peace, but they had to pull out eventually too. And it still remains a conflicted area of turmoil that doesn't necessarily flare up all the time, but you definitely have tensions currently. Sri Lanka. All right, so we zoom into where Sri Lanka is here on the southern tip of India, right there at the directly southern portion of Asia. And there's been fighting since 1983 between the Sinhalese and the Tamils. You can see how we're divided there. So the Sinhalese are the Buddhist religion. They're the larger population, and they dominate the government and commerce. Whereas the Tamils, or the Hindu, they feel underrepresented. So of course, whenever you have a group that feels underrepresented, but it's a large enough group, you're going to have turmoil. And that's the situation going on between these two ethnicities in Sri Lanka. And then we come to India. This is one of my favorite stories, and Gandhi is one of my favorite historical figures. So we've got the situation where there's two different ethnicities. There's more than that, but there's two in India. And in the 1800s, when Britain, the empire, comes and takes over India, they maintain some control because they have their military strength and they maintain order because of that. But we've really got this struggle between the British, the Muslim, and the Hindu. And Gandhi, if you don't know, we're going to study this extensively later on in our year, he works to end the British rule of the country. And he wants to unite everyone in all of these ethnicities, and he really came a long way. And the cool thing about Gandhi is he forced out the British Empire by non-violent means. So in 1947, the British ends its colonial rule of the Indian subcontinent, which is what we're looking at here, India. And Gandhi was really happy because it looked like they were going to gain their independence and everyone was going to live together forever in peace, but it didn't happen because they had this ethnic conflict. What they ended up having to create was the separate India here in the mainland, and that was the Hindu religion. And then we had two separate areas of Pakistan created where they were Muslim. So we have this Western Pakistan and what was over here Eastern Pakistan. But there was still conflict among ethnicities, and there was too much separation between these Muslim Pakistani regions. So they separated again, and Bangladesh became what had previously been East Pakistan. During this time, there was, of course, large issues with the border areas around here, and they still, to this day, have conflict. Let's look at some more examples here. Have you heard about the Kurds? Well, it's a group that is an ethnicity but they don't have any state or nationality to call their own because they don't have a designated area. So we're looking at the Caucasus Mountains here, and it's in the area of Syria, Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and southern USSR over here, but this is southern Russia, what used to be the former Soviet Union. But we're looking at the Caucasus Mountains over here, and this is the area where the Kurds are. So what we've got is a group of Sunni Muslims who are wanting to establish a nationality, a recognized political border for themselves, and they're trying to do that in these countries like Turkey and Iraq and Iran, and it's just never happening. And whenever they get the chance, they vie for power in these areas, but there's always regulations and governmental policies and physical conflict that occurs to keep them being an ethnicity that doesn't have their own state. Other examples of ethnicities, we've got Iraq, and we've got the competition between the Arab Muslims and the Kurdish people here. And we had a lot going on in Iraq back in the 80s and 90s when the United States went in for various reasons. But the United States goes into Iraq and they establish the semblance of a democratic government, but it really didn't last because there wasn't much support for it. The Arabs didn't appreciate it. The Kurds did because they felt like the United States was helping to establish their own national, politically recognized state, but there was too much turmoil between those three ethnicities. It's really unstable to this day. Iran. We've got historically the Persians here, which follow the Shiite Muslim tradition, and there's so many other ethnicities within this region, but the dominant one is going to be the Shiite Muslims, or what's recognized as the Persians. Afghanistan, another area with lots of conflict between ethnicities. One of the major ethnicities that stood out was the Taliban, and we know that the United States came into conflict with them back in 2001 when we had the scenario that was stated as the Taliban attackers coming in and destroying the World Trade Center. So previous to that, we had the Soviet Union and the Russians going into Afghanistan to deal with the ethnicities for various reasons, and as you know, that area is just devastated by conflict between the two major superpowers of Russia and the United States, and all of these warring ethnicities. And we finish it up with Pakistan, where Punjabi is the prevalent ethnicity, and these are Shiite Muslims. But you see, when you line all these up together with people who are so passionate about their ethnicities and the influence of outside forces such as England, the United States, and Russia, we're going to have continued conflict, and there's not much room for peace because everybody's always vying for power and control of land and their religious. Einstein, The Cultural Landscape book, we're going to take a look at why do ethnicities engage in ethnic cleansing and genocide. These are terrible atrocities, horrible things to do to people. Why are they even happening? Ethnic cleansing. This is where you have a more powerful ethnic group that forcibly removes a less powerful group to create a homogeneous region, meaning they want to get rid of people who are different from them so they can create an area where everybody is the same. Now, the largest sampling of this happening was during and after World War II, when we see the forcible removal of Jews, Gypsies, and other such ethnicities between the years of 1935 and 1945. And we all know what happened in the concentration camps there that was orchestrated by the Nazis in Germany. But during the World War and after the war, you saw mass migrations of ethnicities because they were forced or they didn't want things to happen to them again. Now let's look at Yugoslavia. If you look over here, we're in the Balkan Peninsula, which to get a reference for where that is, you see Greece down here, you see Italy, the boot over here. So Yugoslavia used to be a country that housed multiple ethnicities within its one country or nationality. So this area had a large history, it had a long history of conflict. After World War I, the country of Yugoslavia was created by the Allies due to everyone speaking the similar South Slavic language. So they called it Yugo, which was the prefix meaning South. The nationalities that were housed within this country were the Croats, Macedonians, Montenegrins, Serbs, and Slovenes. They also spoke different languages. They spoke Croatian, Macedonian, Serbian, and Slovene. On top of that, you have different religions. You have the Roman Catholics, you have the Eastern Orthodox, and Islam. So there's lots of different backgrounds here, people that are very passionate about what they believe, how they speak, and how they live. So of course it's going to be a problem. Well, in 1953, you had President Broz Tito, who governed over this state, this nationality of Yugoslavia here, and everything was fine because he was a really good leader that was able to hold everything together and taught everyone to celebrate their differences. That's kind of like what we try to do in our class, right? But when he died in 1990, the state of Yugoslavia quickly went downhill because everyone started to feel independent, they felt separate, and their differences were things that came up as blockades from staying together. So it went downhill from there. And in fact, this term called Balkanization, this here, of course, is the Balkan Peninsula. Balkanization means a state when a nation breaks down through its conflict of ethnicities, and that term is used, commonly today. So we dig into one of the states that used to be in former Yugoslavia, and that's Bosnia and Herzegovina. The large ethnicities within that former state were Serbians, Croatians, and Bosnian Muslims. What happened is you had the majority of Bosnian Muslims over here, 40%, but the Serbs and Croatians got together because they felt like they were kind of similar ethnicities, and they decided to attempt to force out the Bosnian Muslims. And so you had a large conflict there, and that still continues on to this day. Another region in former Yugoslavia was Kosovo. It is Kosovo to this day. But when Yugoslavia dissolves, you had a situation where Serbia wanted to force their way into the region of Kosovo and get rid of the Albanians who they felt were encroaching on their territory. So because of this, the United States and European allies began an air campaign striking the Serbians to push them back to allow the Albanians to have what they felt like was their territory. In the end, the conflict basically remains to this day, and it still hasn't been resolved. So we look at an example of how these conflicts get documented. And when the situation in Kosovo was happening, there were a lot of people in the United States and European nations who couldn't grasp the atrocities that were going on. They couldn't believe it. And so here's a specific example. This is aerial photography of a town called Glodane in Kosovo. And what we see here is the place where the citizens, the Albanians, live. You can see their houses right here, some of their buildings and places of business. But what you also see, these red circles here, are armored vehicles. These are vehicles that are coming to force the people out of their houses. And those are Serbian armored vehicles. Over here in the red area, you see all the vehicles of the Albanians. They're all piled up in one area. And what starts to feel awful is you can see all the people rounded up in one area. They're displaced because of the violence in their home region. So just outside of where they're living, this dark area, this is all masses of people, and they're piled up here. And what the aerial photography revealed was that in this picture, you can see all the people here, you can see their vehicles. In the following pictures that were taken, there were no people, there were no vehicles, and their houses were all on fire. So this is one of the proofs that the world was able to see and get involved with the atrocities that were going on in Kosovo. All right, so now we're moving over to Africa. Specifically, we're looking at the region of the Sudan, which used to be the country of Sudan, but it's now split up into South Sudan and Sudan. Genocide. We move from ethnic cleansing, which is terrible on its own, to a description where we see the mass killing of a group of people, not to move them out, but to eliminate them from existence. So this is different from ethnic cleansing, which, I mean, honestly, they're kind of the same, because in the other examples, people were killing each other. So this is one of those political terms that is a gray area for who's trying to define it and for what reason. But in any case, we see here in the region of the Sudan, in 1980s, a civil war broke out between the black Christian and animist rebels versus the Arab Muslim government in the north. So the Arab Muslim government, they attempted to create one nationality with only Muslim traditions. They have laws that separate genders at all events, at school functions, and on all transportation. So this became an enormous conflict because you had the Muslim background and then you had the Christian and animist background, and that didn't mesh well together. Specifically, you may have heard of the Darfur region, which is on the western part of Sudan, where you had black Africans rise up, and they were rebelling due to discrimination and neglect. In 2003, this is where you started to see this horrendous conflict. But because the government wanted their control, they incorporated some Arab nomads, and they began a fight that slaughtered people by the hundreds of thousands. In fact, this is one of the largest atrocities that the world has ever known. This was, during my years in high school with you guys, where you are now. But over a few years, you saw 480,000 killed by this conflict. This is genocide. They're going to wipe these people off the face of the earth. On top of that, there's 2.8 million people displaced in refugee camps. So it was a horrendous situation. We look at Ethiopia and Eritrea. So we zoom in. We're on the Horn of Africa over here. We've got Ethiopia, which was an independent nation for 2,000 years. Basically, as long as you can think back, Ethiopia is an independent nation, taking care of itself. Then in 1890, Eritrea becomes an Italian colony, meaning Italy came in and they took it over. In the 1930s, after World War I, and moving into World War II, Italy captures Ethiopia, which is this region right here. So Ethiopia dissolves. So after World War II, when the Nazis and the Axis powers are pushed back, Italy moves out of there, and the United Nations gives Eritrea to Ethiopia. So it gives a small area to Ethiopia. And it's given that with the premise that they're going to be fair and they're going to be equal rights for both areas. But really, that doesn't happen at all, because why would this ethnicity group in Ethiopia want to watch over a different ethnic group in Eritrea? Specifically, when Ethiopia dissolves a language in Eritrea and dissolves their government, we're going to have problems. So a 30-year civil war begins in 1961 and lasts until 1991, where Eritrea does win independence officially. Of course, it didn't last. And in 1998, another war broke out. It continues because they have this border dispute right here on whose land this actually is. And even when we dig in, zoom into Eritrea, we've got ethnic conflict within that country. We've got conflict between the Muslims and the Christians. The same thing in Ethiopia. We've got lots of ethnicities within Ethiopia, as small as a country as it is, but mainly we're looking at turmoil between the Christians and the Muslims. Somalia. Now we're really on the Horn of Africa. In the 1990s, the government collapses. You have struggle for control by a series of clans, each with separate armies. You have complex alliances that form, and they interact with each other. In 1992, the U.S. sends troops in to protect relief organizations like the Red Cross, who are there to, serve, protect, bring medicine and paramedicine, trying to heal people who are in these terrible conditions. And people bring in food, and they can't do it. So the U.S. sends in troops to protect the relief organizations. In 1994, these peace talks fail. So things start to collapse again. Islamist militias take control in 2004. And back in 2007, you have the U.S. that comes in, they're bombing because, of course, they're wanting to fight terrorists. So this poor area of the globe is just bombarded. The situation continues to be worsened, and it's not looking good because we've got drought that's just devastated the region. So poor Africa, they cannot get a leg up. Central Africa. Rwanda. We're looking at the Hutus versus the Tutsis. And if you have seen the movie Hotel Rwanda, which is what we're doing right now during this unit in AP Human Geography, you might know what's going on. So historically, the Tutsi are cattle herders. They come in and they overtake the Hutu farmers that lived in the region of Rwanda about 400 years ago. So back historically, we have a problem. When Germany invades and takes over Rwanda in World War I, they start to be the first group of people that really make sure people are separated and identified, furthering this problem between these two ethnicities. After World War II, Rwanda is governed by Belgium, who separates them officially by giving them identity cards. So we really start to see that even though they look alike, and we probably couldn't tell them apart, they have identity cards that separate them. Rwanda gains independence in 1962, and the Hutus choose this as their time to clear out the Tutsis. And so the Tutsis, they retreat to Uganda. Just a number of years later, like not even 30 years later, the Tutsis come back and they create incredible conflict. And this is where you really get into the Rwanda genocide. In 1994, the Hutu president is assassinated, which is cause for incredible mass genocides where 800,000 Tutsis are killed in 3 months. This conflict, although it settled down, it continues as it poured into the neighboring countries in Africa. And of course, the Congo. This Hutu and Tutsi conflict, it did continue. It spilled over to other regions of Africa. Within the Congo, you've got 5.4 million people that died during the civil war between the Hutu and the Tutsi. This is the deadliest in the Congo since World War II. The Tutsis overthrow President Mobutu in 1997, and they start to kill all the Hutus. So the Hutus get neighboring countries to join in, and they go against the Tutsis, and this conflict just continues. So we look at the colonial legacy of Africa, and really we don't see many good things.
What we do see is Europeans, North Americans taking resources back to their countries and leaving the continent of Africa in turmoil. There are boundaries there, but really they're created politically by the European countries. They set them in and they split them up between the European countries. But they didn't take into indication, they didn't take into account the tribes and ethnicities when they were making these boundaries. So these tribes and ethnicities, they are separated. So how can you have one tribe, one ethnicity between two nations? That's going to cause conflict. So really, we've got some bad situations maybe.
Hey, hello once again, and welcome to AP Human Geography, Where Are States Distributed? Rubenstein, The Cultural Landscape, Chapter 8, Key Issue 1, with your host, Andrew Patterson. Defining states. So we look around the world and we see all these nations or countries, and they're also called states. It's an area organized into a political unit, ruled by established governments with control over its affairs. Now, we're not talking about the U.S. states, because those are part of the nation or the state of the United States of America. Countries are also called states, and they have sovereignty. They're independent from control of internal affairs from outside states. So sovereignty means don't mess with our state, don't mess with our country, because we're in charge. No one tells us what to do in our house. We have sovereignty. Like, for example, we don't want Russia coming into the United States and affecting our election per se, which potentially happened in 2016, because we have our own sovereignty and Russia shouldn't be affecting our state. Problems defining states. So we try to define what countries are and where they are. Sometimes it's clear and sometimes it tends to be a problem. So for example, with North and South Korea, we think of them as one state of Korea, but obviously right now, and since the 1950s, 60s, they've been separated into two states, North and South Korea. And yet sometimes people still claim to be Korean or just simply from Korea. Another issue when we try to define states is China and Taiwan. You see the entire country of China here, and we've also got Taiwan, who claims to be independent. Some people think of them as an independent country. Some people think that, well, they're just an area that's still Chinese, but they kind of have their independent rule. And then the Western Sahara is in a similar situation. States of varying sizes. Well, you think about it, it should be easy to define a state because you look at the map and bam, it's clearly outlined. That's pretty easy when you think of places like Russia, which are huge, takes up an entire continent almost. China, Canada, these are huge states. Then you think about states that are as small as cities like Monaco, Andorra, and Malta. Like, for example, there's Malta in down there, right off the boot of Italy and Sicily. Then we have little Malta. How does that compare to Russia? Well, geographically speaking, as far as size, it's pretty small. A world of states. So the United Nations, in our book, it claims that this is the most important organization in all of the world. That seems to be an opinion to me, and yet here it is presented to us. But the United Nations is an organization that is created by the victorious allies after World War II. So we're talking about 1945 after that. It was replaced by, it replaced the failed League of Nations, which was established after World War II, an organization trying to maintain peace. It didn't work out because, guess what, the United States, even though the president suggested it, the United States didn't go in on it. So they tried again with the United Nations, and so far it's been working. So the United Nations is a forum for discussion of international problems. Whenever there's a conflict, the United Nations gets together and talks about it and sees whether they need to intervene or whether they can place sanctions against a certain actor in the conflict. But sometimes they'll intervene. You think about the Rwandan conflict. If you've seen the movie Hotel Rwanda, the UN goes in and they try to protect both sides, but really they're not able to do much because they don't have enough people. And the UN also seeks to address international cooperation on world issues. The state concept, where did it come from? Why isn't it just like all of us living together and doing whatever we want? Well, ancient states, like the city-states of Athens, where you have a city that's kind of like its own state. Athens was thought of as like it's a country. Like it's just a city, but it and the surrounding countryside are really thought of as a city-state, where it governs itself. It's not connected to other cities. I mean, when you look at Greece, there's other cities there like Sparta, but really Athens and Sparta fought against each other, and they came together, and then they fought with other countries against each other. So it's kind of like these city-states are their own entities. You have countries, like the entire country of Egypt. This is well known. It's marked out on the map, and it's got its own sovereignty. It controls itself. So it's an entire large area that is the state concept of Egypt. Early European medieval states, these are states that were consolidated by kings after the fall of the Roman Empire. So you have the Roman Empire starting here from Rome, Italy, and it spreads out across the earth there in the Mediterranean. And as it moves up into northern Europe, it establishes roads and commerce and trade. And then when the Roman Empire collapsed, you had kings that stepped in and took control of these areas. So they kept control of these states or large areas by just their authority that they had in their armies. Then the nation state, where you have a territory that corresponds to an ethnicity. So you think about where is a nation state, where it's just a similar group of people who define themselves as a nation. You think about Denmark, for example. They are one area that everyone, for the most part, people there are Danes, and they all live in Denmark. So it's a very similar area. That's different than the United States because we have so many different ethnicities that live here in the United States that we can't say it's a nation state because we're not all the same. The most important principle is self-determination within the state concept. Within a nation state, they claim and desire self-determination, where their ethnicity has the right to govern themselves. So that's A2. We're going to take a look at why are nation states difficult to create. Well, a nation state, we should know by now that it is a territory occupied by one ethnicity. You think about the people that are pretty much all the same. That's why it's their own nation. A multi-ethnic state, this is where you have more than one ethnicity. Our sample is the United States, where we have so many ethnicities here in our country. It would be difficult to say, all right, everyone who is Jewish, this is now our nation state in the USA because we have so many more ethnicities than that, right? Multinational state, this is more than one ethnicity with self-determination. So Russia has a number of these where people are able to have some kind of control that's more than just the government level, where you've got ethnicities that are living in the same area and they also have some sort of authority within themselves. So here, what we've got going on with the whole nation state and ethnicities clash, this is a Czech clock changed from religious apostles to just normal workers by the communists who came in. So when you have ethnicities that try to maintain their own sovereignty, that tends to get into issue with different political parties. Specifically here, we're looking at the Soviet Union when the communists came in. And this used to be like the disciples of Jesus, and the communists changed it to just normal workers. Nation states in Europe. We look at Denmark, where you have 90% of the people speaking Danish. These are the Danes in this country right here. And consequently, they also own Greenland. Now, Greenland does end up doing a lot of their own political decisions, and they have a lot of their own sovereignty, but they do still follow a lot of what goes on in Denmark as well. Slovenia also, where you've got 97% of the population are Slovenes. Nation states and their ethnic identity. Well, how do we understand what ethnic identity is? Is ethnicity just wearing like quaint costumes? Whenever you travel to a different country, like you go to Peru and they have traditional people that are dressed up in their garb and they're holding alpacas and they're standing there to get some money and get a picture taken with them. Is that ethnicity? Is it, when you go to maybe a reservation in Oklahoma, and you've got Native Americans dressed up with feathers and moccasins and teepees and stuff. Is that ethnicity? And people tend to think of that being what ethnicity might be. Karl Marx said that workers should identify with each other, not with nationalism or ethnicity. And this is where you start to see the issue with communism, because the ideas of Karl Marx ended up being embedded into a lot of what communism was. And of course, Karl Marx and communists, they want to see the Communist Party as the authority and not your ethnicity or nationalism. Now, part of the idea with Karl Marx too was that what's important is that workers stand together, and it doesn't matter what your ethnicity. But there's a whole lot of different input that go into defining nation states and dealing with ethnicities. You look at Yugoslavia. When it broke up, some ethnicities broke up to have their own sovereignty or their own state country, but others, because they were on differing borders, got into a lot of conflicts, and to this day still have a lot of issues. The communists, of course, discourage ethnicity in favor of the power and the sovereignty of the controlling government or the state. Independent nation states wow, I am off. Let me start that over. Independent nation states in the former Soviet states. So we're looking at Russia, and you got this huge area here of the satellite Soviet states, which were independent countries, but they were tied into the Soviet government there. Lithuania, they are 85% Lithuanian. So we have a lot of people that are the same. Their religion is Roman Catholic, and they speak a Balto-Slavic language. So in Lithuania up here, it seems pretty easy to keep them all in one country as a nation state. Estonia, over here, they're 69% Estonians. Their background is Protestant, and they speak the Uralic language. Latvia, it's 59% Latvian, they're Lutheran, and they speak a Balto-Slavic language. So these three ethnicity nation states up here are pretty clear. You can see the boundary right here between Estonia and Latvia, and you get a feel for the conflict that could have taken place in the north here when they dropped from the Soviet states, but really it's been pretty clear for these groups of people, these nation states. Independent nation states and former Soviet states. We continue by looking down at some of the European states, like Belarus. You've got 81% are part of that ethnicity. They're isolated from Russia, and part of their background is they were conquered by the Mongols, the Poles, and Lithuanians. So you do start to see a lot more of that differing ethnicity input there. In Ukraine, only about 78% are Ukrainian. It's kind of the similar situation as in Belarus. But you think about in the Ukraine, you have started to have a lot of contention, especially in the last 10 years. We've heard a lot on the news that there's been conflict between, do Ukrainians want to be part of Russia, or do they want to be independent as part of their own country? And this is where you start to see the 78%. It's a little bit dropping in number as far as some of the other states are more like 80 or 90%. This one's kind of dropping more towards the 50% level. I mean, it's still pretty high, but there's points of contention between, can it be its own state that takes care of itself, or do they need to be with other people who are like them in Russia? Moldova, again, 78%. It tends to be indistinguishable from the Romanians because it used to be part of Romania. The Soviets changed their boundaries when they had control of it, so now it's really difficult to say, well, we should be part of Romania or we should be independent. Continuing on with former Soviet states, we look at the Central Asian states, Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. We've got over 80% who are those ethnicities. They're mostly Muslim and they speak a Altaic language. Kyrgyzstan, about the same situation. So we've got a bunch of different smaller parties, 69% Kyrgyz, 15% Uzbek, 9% Russian. They seem to be mostly the Muslim background and they speak an Altaic language. So we look over here. This is in Central Asia. Here's Russia. Kazakhstan's a big country over here compared to these little countries and little ethnicities. They're trying to fight for control and sovereignty of their own ethnicities, their own states. And it does get into a lot of contention, especially when you're mixing religion in here as well. Kazakhstan, you got 67% or Kazakhs, 18% Russian. You got the Muslim faith and Altaic language, and we finish up with Tajikistan, which is 80%, so that's pretty big for one ethnicity as far as seeking sovereignty. But you're also dealing with 15% Uzbek and 1% Russian. So you think about, why is there a lot of issues going on here in this area of Central Asia? Well, it's because we have a lot of ethnicities mixed in with religions and former Soviet states. So you can see why there's a lot of turmoil. In Russia, this is the largest multinational state because it recognized 39 ethnic groups as nationalities. You think about the United States, and we have some nations that have been in our country. You think about the Cherokee Nation, the Native Americans. So we have some of that, and Russia has a ton. It has 39. Many of these groups were conquered by Russia in the 16th century by Ivan the Terrible. You may have heard of him. They continue to have their own independence movements, and they're flourishing because Russia has had trouble controlling their vast landscape, especially with their economic collapse after the removal of the Soviet government. So you can see why in this entire area there's a lot of contention. Dealing with ethnicities, economic collapse, former Soviet states, ethnicities vying for their own independence and sovereignty. In Chechnya, after the Soviet breakup, they declared independence. Russia goes back into gaining control. They wanted to prevent other states from leaving. So they really wanted to maintain control of Chechnya. But the caveat, the big piece of this information is there's a lot of petroleum there, which of course you can use for oil, for maintaining your cars and vehicles and economy and weapons in your military. So there's multiple reasons for Russia to be involved in Chechnya. In the Caucasus, these are the mountains separating Russia from Azerbaijan and Georgia between the Black and Caspian Seas. This area right here has been a huge area of contention in the last 10 years because we've got Russia who wants to continue to control its forces, and you have a number of different nationalities. We've got the Azerbaijan, which are 91%. We've got the Armenians, who are 98% of their own area, and you've got Georgia, which their ethnicity controls about 71% of their population. So in this area here, it's a very actual small area and a lot of different ethnicities. Once again, you've got Turkey over here. You've heard a lot about them in the news in 2016, being in 2017. You got a lot going on, continuing with the religions of Muslims and Christians, and it's a big ordeal. Colonies. The colony is a territory which is legally tied to a sovereign state. You think about the colonies here in the United States on the eastern seaboard that were set up in the early 1700s. Colonialism, this is the effort by one country to establish settlements and impose political, economic, and cultural principles. So back in our colonial period, you had Great Britain, who was over here in the territories which are now the United States. They're trying to maintain their authority. They're trying to send goods and services back to the United Kingdom to make money. That has happened across the entire earth. The motives for doing these things, for setting up colonies, have been described as God, gold, and glory. Mainly think of England and France going across the earth to set these things up. For God, they're going to spread Christianity. For gold, they're going to extract resources from these new countries where they have colonies. And the glory, they're going to establish power and open captive markets. Most African and Asian colonies are now independent after World War II. So you think about Great Britain went into Africa and Asia and France too. And they had a lot of control of many areas on these two continents. After World War II, they really lost a lot of their grasp on both of those areas. And so there's not many colonies, if any, in both of those areas of Africa and Asia. The remaining colonies, here's some examples. Puerto Rico, it's a colony of the United States. There's citizens there, but they can't vote. So the U.S. still has control of that. Pitcairn, the United Kingdom, it's got a huge control of this island with 48 islanders. They sell fish and postage stamps to maintain their own lifestyle there. But that's another example. Australia has Lord Howe Island. These are all examples of colonies. Britain has Ascension Island. Chile has Easter Island. If you think of Easter Island, if you remember what that is, that's the place where they have those large stone heads that no one seems to be able to explain why they're there. Greenland, it has a high degree of autonomy and self-rule, but it still follows the Queen of Denmark. So it's kind of a colony of Denmark. Hong Kong, this is a colony of the United Kingdom, but it was returned to China in 1997, which is pretty recent. So it's continued autonomous. It's considered autonomous, meaning having its own power from China in economic matters, but in foreign and military affairs, it's definitely considered still part of China. So you look at the colonies. Here's 1914. Look at how many colonies there are across the earth here. So for the green, the lighter shade of green, we got the United Kingdom. Excuse me, that's an alarm on my phone. We got the United Kingdom here. It's green. So here's the United Kingdom colonies in Canada and Africa, India, Australia. In fact, it was said during this time that the sun never sets on the empire of Great Britain. Because if you look, the sun's going all across everything, and it's all Great Britain all the way across. So yeah, back then in 1914, they had huge colonies all over the place. The United States here had some colonies. Alaska was like a territory, really. What else? Let's see. What's France? Let's look at France. So France, Spain. Okay, here's Spain. You got some colonies in Africa. France has got colonies all over Africa and some in Asia. So 1914. This is before World War I. Okay, 2012, which is just a few years ago. How many colonies do you see here? I mean, really none. Across the oceans, you'll find, like, there's Pitcairn. That's the very tiny island that the United Kingdom still has. So really, it's just remnants of what used to be known as colonies across the earth. So let's look at Chapter 8, Key Issue 2. Human Geography, Chapter 8, Key Issue 3. Why do boundaries cause problems? Types of boundaries. So a boundary, obviously, is an invisible line marking a territory. You think about the state of Texas, which is where we're located here in the state where this is being recorded. You can think of the outline of Texas. Obviously, it's got a recognizable boundary on a map. Of course, when you're looking at it in real life, you really can't see that boundary. A lot of times, sometimes they have walls and things put up, but boundary is like the general idea. It's an invisible line. Frontier. I look down here at this desert over here. Frontier, it's a zone where no state has control. Like perhaps this is the Sahara Desert. I don't know, honestly, if this is or not, but this could be a frontier zone where you could have two countries on either side that don't really have a boundary put up, but just like they don't cross it very often because it's a desert and it's difficult to get through. That's more of a frontier. Boundaries, they can be physical, where it's features on the landscape, like these mountains here between Chile and Argentina, or it could be cultural, a cultural boundary that would follow the characteristics, which would be like geography of a map. Physical boundaries. A desert boundary, which we just talked about, such as the Sahara Desert, separating Algeria, Libya, and Egypt. That's difficult to cross. It becomes a boundary. A mountain boundary, like between Argentina and Chile, the Andes Mountains, which consequently I have been there, so it's an awesome experience. And definitely could create a border between two countries. And then a water boundary. Could be a river, a lake, oceans. Example would be Lake Albert separating the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Uganda. Or think about here in the United States. Like for Texas, we've got the Rio Grande River separating the United States from Mexico. These are different ways that countries are separated. The law of the sea. Now, you think about water as being any man's territory, or, you consider, well, where is it that you're in someone else's country? How close and how far can you be and all that? And this is a good graph about how that works. So internal water. So this is the country over here on the tan. And let's say this is the United States. Well, any water that is within our internal waters, within this baseline here, that's going to be property of the United States. And other countries are not allowed to enter without permission. Territorial waters. So this land right here within 12 nautical miles, that's all territorial waters that nations or states may set regulating passage or regulating transportation through it. The contiguous zone, the next 12 nautical miles, states can enforce these laws containing pollution, taxation, customs, and immigration. So 24 nautical miles out, we're still controlled by the state or the nation or the country right here. And then as we keep going out up to 200 nautical miles, this is the exclusive economic zone where the nation, the state, or the country, it has the sole right to exploit natural resources such as fishing. So for example, if this is the United States, 200 nautical miles out here, you can't have England come over and start fishing right here with their guys and be like, all right, guys, this is ours. No, by international standards, the law of the sea, this 200 nautical miles belongs to the United States of America. And then outside of 200 nautical miles is international waters where no nation, no state has control. And remember, we're not talking about the United States or the states of America. We're talking about countries or nationalities or states. Cultural boundaries. So we've got the geometric boundary where you have like a line that's not necessarily like a mountain range or whatever. It's just known or it's created by people culturally. So an example is the boundary of the U.S.-Canada border. So part of that, 2,100 kilometers. There's a straight line along the 49th north latitude. Here it is right here where there's these people's cabins right here on one side, which maybe this is Canada, and then this side is the United States. And so they've created a cultural boundary here, which, it's physical, they're cutting the trees, but it's created from the cultural 49th latitude parallel. So where, this guy right here, he can't just walk across the side and be like, all right, I'm in the United States for a little bit, I'm gonna go hunting, and then I'm gonna come back to my side. That's not legal. We also think about ethnic boundaries, language separating peoples, such as the Hindu and Pakistan peoples. So you think about that huge conflict with Gandhi and India and the Muslims and the Hindus and everything that was going on there in India. Well, that became an ethnic boundary where you had Pakistan in the north and India in the south. Also, example is Cyprus, the green line there, which we see over here. You have Greek in the south and the Turkish in the north. And even though this country is recognized as one area, Cyprus, one country by the United Nations, you still have this ethnic boundary between the northern Turks and the southern Greeks. Shapes of states. This is kind of fun. It's kind of like obscure because you're like, okay, why are states shaped the way they are? Well, this is a cool way to look at it and kind of consider why people are set up and why ethnicities and why transportation is arranged the way it is. A lot of it's because of political history and things that are necessary for the creation of one government. So within a state, so we look at a compact state. This is where the distance to the center from the borders are equal. It makes it very efficient for communication, for military control, for transportation. So it's not perfectly equal, but this is the general idea. For example, Kenya here, you've got this country where everything is kind of equal. It's all one kind of size. The next one is prorupted, where you've got this natural country here and then this proruption that's prolonged out here, usually for a reason. It provides access or prevents access. So in this case, it is gaining access to this lake over here. So in 1980, the Germans created this proruption right here to gain access to the Zambezi River and to block British communications. So British communications would be going through here, right? Well, none of it's blocked off by this proruption here from the state of Namibia, which the Germans used to have control of. Elongated. This is access. So everyone in the state of Chile, the country of Chile, they have access to the Pacific Ocean for fishing as part of their lifestyle. So you think about, why is it elongated? Why is Chile so long? Why didn't they just, become all this one country right here? Well, it's because of the Andes Mountains. The Andes Mountains are all along right here. On one side, people with the same kind of background are Chilean, they're fishers, and then Argentina is a whole other country because you have to cross the Andes Mountains, and that's really difficult, especially back in the day. So that's why these two countries developed independently. Same thing with Gambia. Look at this. This country this is all the country right here. This is all access to this river. That's why everyone along this river had a certain kind of background. They're all river-based, and so that became one country of Gambia. Fragmented, where it's discontinued, it's separated, where it's not all one piece. So you look at a fragmented state like Indonesia down here, where you've got different pieces of the country all broken up in different pieces, but it's all one country. So it's broken up, it's fragmented. Same with the United States. We've got the mainland right here, the contiguous U.S. We've also got Alaska, which is fragmented off in here, and Hawaii, which is out here. Perforated, where you've got a state within a state. The perforation is right here in South Africa, where you've got the country all around it. So the state that is perforated is South Africa. Perforated meaning a hole. And the country is Lesotho. It's not even marked. But see, that's how good of a teacher I am. I just knew that it was Lesotho. Landlocked, meaning we're stuck on land. We have no access to the sea. For example, in Asia here, we've got Mongolia. It's landlocked. There's no way it can get to the sea. You also think of Botswana over here in southern Africa. It doesn't have access to the sea. Governing states. In the national government, you have different types of government, like a democracy, where the citizens elect leaders. You have an autocracy, where you have people that, like kings, they run the country pretty much for the interests of the leader, and it's not really for the people. You think about a king, we think about an autocracy. Then you also have an anocracy. This is where it's not fully democratic, and it's not fully autocratic. It's kind of mixed. So this anocracy is both the democracy and the autocracy. So in the world today, we're seeing this trend leaning towards democracy, where you've got people wanting to govern themselves. And in the past, it's been kind of the standard for people to follow an autocracy, where there's a king or one person in charge. You really see these things happening when you consider examples like the Arab Spring in 2010, 2011 in Southwest Asia and the North African countries, which would be this over here, where they start to have rebellions, they start to recognize the voice of the people. Specific countries where we saw this change in Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, and Yemen. So as far as governing states, we're really seeing the switch from the autocracies to the democracies. Now, as far as local governments, we've got unitary states where power is in the central government. You see examples of France, Kenya, and Rwanda. We've also got the federal state where power is in local governments, like the United States, Russia, Canada, Brazil, and India. Kind of what we mean is, like, well, don't we have a federal state here in the United States? Yes, the United States has a quote federal government where we're kind of like power in the central government, but really it's federalized, where the states are supposed to have a certain amount of authority to balance out the power of the national government or the federal state. Whereas you think of France, really it's just like one government body is in control of the entire country. Electoral geography. Think about the electoral college here in the United States. It's a way of building districts that report to the higher voting authority. One of the things that you see go wrong in this process is where people will change the size and the shape of their district in order to get more political votes. And that's really illegal. In fact, that term is called gerrymandering. It's a process of redrawing legislative boundaries for the purpose of benefiting the party in power. This was named for Elbridge Gerry, who lived from 1744 to 1814. He was the governor of Massachusetts, and he signed a bill to redistrict his state to look in his favor. And it ended up, looking a lot like a salamander. These days, I don't think salamander is a very common animal that we talk about, but it's very slinky and elongated. In a way, it's kind of like a snake with legs, and that's the way his district looked. So, that manipulation was seen as illegal, and gerrymandering has been deemed illegal. We're going to take a look at why do states cooperate and compete. One of the first examples we have of states competing and aligning with each other in more modern times is the Cold War. We think about that time after World War II and what happened up to like the 1990s. So in the early 20th century, so when we say 20th century, we're talking about the early 1900s. Early 20th century powers, you had major states that were Austria, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States of America. After World War II, this becomes a really unbalanced situation with just two superpowers standing out, which were the United States of America and the Soviet Union. And again, this is between after World War II or during 1940s, there, it's the middle of it, and up to the 1990s. In these type of situations, and after World War II, you would see Russia going into countries to bolster them up. They sent troops in because they wanted to protect them. They didn't want people leaving their countries, and they didn't want people coming in to take them over. Example countries were Hungary and Czechoslovakia. But the U.S. does the same thing, where we sent troops into the Dominican Republic, into Grenada, and to Panama. And so both sides really are vying for power in states that aren't their own, but in states where they were setting up strategic powers and military installations. During the height of this, in the 1960s, early in the 1960s, you have President John F. Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis. And you can see some of the satellite images here where the United States had a lot of concern about what Soviet Russia was doing in Cuba, where they brought in or were building missile silos and missile launch capabilities just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. And that was a big concern. A lot of this was strategic positioning of both of the superpowers to see perhaps who would have more power in that delicate balance that was going on. And the cooperation that you had in Europe were really two-sided as well, where you had NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which the United States was a part of, and the Warsaw Pact, which consisted of the Eastern Communist countries. And these two organizations really went against each other. You look at the European military and economic alliances over the years. So in 1980, in the height of the Cold War, you've got Eastern Europe over here, Soviet Russia, which has got all of this. These are a lot of the Warsaw Pact countries. And you have Western Europe, where you've got this European community, NATO over here, that's on the other side of all this going on. You also have some countries that are like in with NATO, but not really tied into the European community. Fast forward to 2013, at the time of the printing of this book, and it's a much different situation to where most countries are, all of them are embedded into NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. After the collapse of Soviet Russia, you really saw countries switching over to democracy and to joining of NATO. Economic alliances in Europe. How do people work together? Well, you've got the European Union, the EU. It was formed in 1958 by the countries of Belgium, France, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and West Germany. Over the years, it has expanded to more countries after the fall of communism, and it's governed by a parliament with representation from each country. What the European Union does is it gives subsidies to farmers, and it helps struggling regions. Most of these trade barriers across the European Union are removed, where you see the free movement of cargo and trade and transactions and commerce. They have a common currency. You think of the euro, where you can use that money in any country that's in the European Union. And English tends to be the common language. And things were really moving forward for the European Union. And then in 2016, which is 1 month from the recording of this video, the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union through what was termed the Brexit, or the Britain exit, where Europe really was feeling like, the United Kingdom was really feeling like culturally they were not satisfied with what was going on with the European Union because they didn't really feel like they had their own culture anymore. The second thing was economic concerns. Not only did the United Kingdom have to pay money to the European Union to be a part of it, but a lot of the money was leaving the country in fees and trade and commerce that was going elsewhere, plus having to support other countries that were struggling like Greece. For all of these reasons, the United Kingdom has voted recently to leave the European Union. And so while it's a good setup, there's also a lot of issues with it as well. And you can see just recently the United Kingdom left. Terrorism. We're still looking at why states cooperate or why are they, kind of against each other. Well, one of the things that gets states to work together to fight against is terrorism. Terrorism is the systematic use of violence by a group in order to intimidate a population or coerce a government. Examples over the course of history that have affected the United States was 1988, the Pan Am Flight 103 in Lockerbie, Scotland, that was blown up. In 93, you got the car bomb under the World Trade Center, but it didn't destroy the World Trade Center. 95, you had the car bomb in the Murrah building in Oklahoma City, where it was huge news because I was a kid back then. I was just entering college, and they blew up the whole building. 1996, there was a truck bomb that killed U.S. soldiers in Saudi Arabia. In 98, there were embassies in Kenya and Tanzania that were bombed. In 2000, the USS Cole, which was a ship that was bombed in Yemen. And of course, the big one that is still fresh on a lot of people's minds is 2001, which was the September 11th attacks where they struck the Pentagon, the plane went down in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, and the 2 World Trade Center buildings. And so we asked the question, why do states form alliances? And in these situations dealing with the United States, states join together to form a coalition to fight extreme terrorism because of these things that built up over time. And the premise that's been given to us is that countries, including the United States, have gone in to fight against states that support terrorism. They've gone in to fight countries that supply sanctuary or a place for these terrorist groups to train, for them to get money, for them to store weapons, to create weapons. And so from our book, just reading straight off the facts that were presented, we gathered together as countries to go fight terrorism. Now, as a individual person, not necessarily as a teacher, I want to caution all of us on this situation and get us to think that, okay, there's a lot more reasons that we went into countries to go fight. And I don't want to get into all that, but I also don't want to be the teacher that just does what he's told and mentions everything as it is in the textbook. I think there's a lot more reason for banding together, and terrorism has been used as that tool. But there's a little hint into that. That's chapter 8, key